Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Tonight we drift into the desert silence of New Mexico, where in the summer of 1947, something fell from the sky that would change the way people look at the stars forever. As you settle into rest, let the rhythm of this story guide you deeper into calm. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow the quiet weight of the desert to carry you into slumber. The desert has always kept its own kind of silence. It is not empty, not truly. At night, the land hums softly with life, the whisper of wind across sage, the faint shuffle of unseen animals, the creak of old fences under starlight. Above it all, the sky stretches vast and endless, crowded with stars that seem close enough to touch. In Roswell, in 1947, those stars were the constant companions of farmers, ranchers, and soldiers alike. Life was ordinary then. Families gathered around glowing radios, their voices softened by the heat of the day and the cool of the night. Ranchers tended cattle across wide fields, their days marked by dust, sweat, and the slow rhythm of work. Children ran barefoot across yards, chasing fireflies, their laughter rising toward the heavens. It was a place of routine, a place where the vast desert sky offered comfort and order. But sometimes even the quietest skies carry weight. Sometimes the silence feels as though it holds a secret just beyond the edge of sound. And in July of that year, the silence broke. Some remembered a flash of light that streaked across the horizon, brighter than a falling star, faster than any plane they had known. Others spoke of a low sound, not thunder, not storm, but something heavier, distant, like the earth itself, shifting. For most, the night passed without event. Radios played, lights dimmed, families drifted to sleep. But far from town, across open ranch land, the desert received something it had never seen before. The morning after, rancher William Mack Brazel rode out across his land, as he had countless times. His sheep grazed quietly, moving through the brush in steady rhythm, but as the sun rose higher, glinting across the plains, something caught his eye. Scattered across the ground lay strange debris, metallic and bright, stretched across a field, as though the sky itself had shattered. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, thin sheets of material that crumpled easily in the hand, but sprang back to shape as if alive. Beams of strange metal, light as wood, but unyielding, fragments that shone in the sunlight, with a color not quite silver, not quite anything familiar. His animals refused to cross the area, their instincts restless, and Brazel himself felt the unease of something that did not belong. This was the beginning of the story, a story that would ripple far beyond the fences of a quiet ranch, far beyond the streets of Roswell. Soldiers would arrive, swift and deliberate. Reports would be written, then rewritten. Announcements would be made, then retracted. The desert's secret would be claimed, hidden, and argued over for generations. But here in this story, we are not rushing toward answers. We are not seeking proof or certainty. We are moving slowly, step by step, through the silence of the desert, through the whispers of witnesses, through the faint rustle of files pulled from locked cabinets. Each detail will unfold like a page turned carefully, each moment steady, each word chosen to guide you deeper into calm. You may drift into sleep as the story continues. That is welcome. The desert holds its silence, whether your eyes are open or closed. The voices of 1947 will remain patient, waiting in the stillness. The night was not empty. The sky was not still, and in the quiet fields outside Roswell, a mystery began that has never ended. The desert stretched outward in every direction, endless and unbroken. By day it shimmered with heat, its pale soil cracked under a sky that seemed larger than any horizon should allow. By night it cooled quickly, the air sharpening as stars burned above with diamond clarity. This was the land around Roswell in 1947, quiet, steady, and seemingly eternal. Life moved slowly here. Ranchers rose before dawn, the creak of barn doors and the lowing of cattle marking the rhythm of each morning. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently. Dust rose from dry paths, and children ran barefoot in yards while their parents listened to news spilling from radios in calm voices. The war had ended just 2 years earlier, but its shadow still lingered. Soldiers had come home, ration stamps had faded into memory, and America's gaze was beginning to turn toward a future filled with hope and invention. Yet, out here, far from Washington, far from the bustle of new cities, the desert kept its own pace. Roswell was small, unassuming, a place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled quicker than the wind, and where the night sky was the closest thing to theater. On summer evenings, families sat on porches and leaned back in wooden chairs, watching the Milky Way drift overhead. The stars were so numerous that the sky seemed crowded, as though some unseen hand had spilled a jar of light across black velvet. Most saw comfort in those stars. They represented constancy, a reminder that even as the world changed, the heavens stayed the same. But a few felt something else, a twinge of unease, a sense that perhaps the stars were watching in return. It was into this quiet setting that the first whispers of change would arrive, not loudly, not with thunder, but with silence that seemed heavier than usual. Some nights, ranchers noticed the air felt different. A stillness would settle, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. Dogs barked at empty skies. Horses stamped nervously without cause, and sometimes faint streaks of light would cross the heavens, moving too quickly, too deliberately, to be falling stars. Most dismissed such moments as tricks of the eye. After all, the desert could play games with perception. Heat made mirages shimmer, distance swallowed sound, and starlight sometimes deceived even the sharpest gaze. But for those who felt the unease, there was a quiet recognition that the land was not as empty as it appeared. The summer of 1947 was hot, even by desert standards. Days scorched, nights cooled quickly, and thunderstorms rolled across the plains with sudden violence before leaving silence in their wake. Farmers prayed for rain, children chased shade, and ranchers like William Mack Brazel worked long days under an unrelenting sun. Brazel's ranch lay miles from town, a wide expanse of scrub and grass where sheep grazed in scattered groups. He lived a simple life, far from headlines, his days dictated by weather, animals, and the slow churn of the seasons. He knew his land well, each fence line, each patch of brush, each rocky outcrop. Nothing surprised him here, until, one July morning, something did. As he rode out across the fields, the early sun casting long shadows, he noticed a glint on the ground. At first he thought little of it, perhaps broken glass or a discarded tin. But as his horse drew closer, more glints appeared. The ground seemed scattered with debris, bright and strange against the soil. He dismounted, frowning. Pieces lay everywhere, covering a wide area. Some looked like thin sheets of metal, light as paper but unterrible. Others were stiff rods, oddly light yet strong. When he bent one fragment, it sprang back to its original shape, as if it resisted being bent at all. The material was unfamiliar, foreign, almost alive in its resilience. His sheep refused to cross the field. They balked, bleated nervously, and circled wide. Animals often sensed what humans overlooked, and Brazel felt the same unease growing in his chest. This was no weather balloon, no ordinary wreck. The debris lay too widely scattered, too unusual in form. Something had fallen here, and it was not anything he recognized. He gathered a few pieces into his hands, their surfaces cool and smooth despite the morning sun. They made little sound as they touched, lighter than aluminum, yet somehow stronger. He turned them over, puzzled, wondering whether to mention it to anyone at all. The desert around him remained silent, as though it too was watching. The sheep bleated uneasily, the wind shifted, and the fragments in his hands seemed to carry a weight that was not measured in size. Whatever had fallen from the sky, it did not belong. Mac Brazel lingered in the field longer than he intended. The morning sun had risen higher, its light catching on every strange shard scattered across the grass. He crouched, turning fragments over in his hands again and again, as if repetition might reveal their nature. But each piece remained stubbornly mysterious, light yet firm, pliant yet unbreakable, thin as foil but indestructible under his grip. The rancher was a practical man, not prone to fantasy. His world was measured in fences mended, sheep counted, storms weathered, yet as he gathered a handful of debris, he knew instinctively that this was not something he could explain away. No storm had left it. No aircraft he had ever seen could have shed such material. It felt foreign to the land itself, as if the desert had been visited by something it could not name. He loaded several pieces onto his horse, careful to balance their odd weight, and made his way back toward his homestead. The sheep followed reluctantly, skirting the field with uneasy cries. Brazel glanced back more than once, the glinting fragments lying like spilled stars against the soil. The sight unsettled him. He knew he would return, but part of him already wished he had not found them at all. Back at the ranch house, he laid the debris out on a table. His family gathered, their voices hushed as they touched the strange material. His son bent one piece sharply, only to watch it snap back into perfect shape. His daughter pressed another fragment between her hands, surprised at its coolness even in the heat of midday. Their curiosity was bright, innocent, but Brazel's unease deepened. He told them not to speak of it beyond the ranch. For a few days he kept the fragments to himself. He went about his work, riding the pastures, tending to his sheep, repairing fences under the hot July sun. But each time he passed the debris field, the glint caught his eye. It seemed to spread wider than he remembered, as if the land itself had been dusted with metallic ash. He could not ignore it, and neither could the whispers beginning to circulate in town. Roswell was a small place. Word traveled faster than trucks down its dusty roads. Someone mentioned seeing strange lights in the sky, bright flashes that vanished in silence. Others spoke of unusual sounds, low, resonant, unlike thunder, yet carrying the same weight. At first, these were nothing more than idle remarks in barbershops or at the edge of church steps. But in a town where news was scarce and gossip plentiful, even small remarks found purchase. Brazel felt the pressure building. He was not a man given to flights of imagination, and he disliked being the center of attention. But the unease gnawed at him. The debris was too strange, too persistent. Eventually, he loaded several fragments into his truck and drove the long road into Roswell itself. The pieces clinked softly with each bump, their dull metallic sheen catching the desert sun through the back window. At the sheriff's office, he laid them out carefully before George Wilcox, the county sheriff. Wilcox was a measured man, stern but fair, used to dealing with cattle rustlers and small-town disputes. He frowned, turning the fragments over, pressing them with his thumb, even trying to score one with his pocket knife. The material resisted every test. "This isn't from around here," he murmured at last. His tone carried more weight than curiosity. He looked at Brazel, eyes sharp. "Where did you say you found it?" Brazel described the field. Wilcox listened, his face unreadable, then gathered the pieces into a box. He said little more, only that the military at Roswell Army Airfield should be informed. The rancher left uneasy, his duty done, but the weight of what he had delivered settled heavily on his shoulders. That night, the desert seemed even quieter than usual. Stars burned bright above the plains, scattered in impossible numbers. Yet for Brazel, the sky no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like a question: what had fallen across his land, and why did the silence now seem to listen in return? Back in town, Sheriff Wilcox made his call. The Army would need to see the debris. Roswell Army Airfield, home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear-capable unit in the world at the time, did not take such reports lightly. Soldiers would come, trucks would roll into the desert, and soon, the fragments of metal lying quiet in a rancher's field would be carried away under military guard. But on that first night, before uniforms arrived, before headlines shifted, before the story became one of denial and debate, the desert itself held the secret. Stars glimmered coldly above, the land lay quiet, and in a lonely ranch house, a family lay awake wondering if the sky would ever feel the same again. The silence deepened, the night grew darker, and Roswell drifted toward a storm that would never truly pass. The desert morning broke quietly. Pale light spilled across the plains, the first rays stretching long and low over the horizon. At the Brazil Ranch, the day began as it always did, with the call of birds, the shuffle of sheep, the creak of wood in the cooling air. But on this morning, Mac Brazil rose with a weight he could not shake. He had spoken to the sheriff. He had handed over fragments, and now he knew the army would come. He saddled his horse as he always did, but the air felt different, heavier. The land seemed to hold its breath. As he rode out, the debris field shimmered under the sun, strange pieces scattered across the soil like frost that refused to melt. His sheep once again avoided the area, circling wide as if some unseen barrier stood between them and the fragments. Brazil dismounted and crouched beside one of the larger pieces. He pressed it flat against the earth, watching as the light bent strangely across its surface. It felt alien, not in origin he could name, but in presence. By midday, the first vehicles appeared. Dust rose on the horizon, small plumes that grew into columns as jeeps and trucks approached. Soldiers in crisp uniforms dismounted with practiced efficiency. They carried crates, cameras, notebooks. Their boots struck the soil in steady rhythm, and their eyes scanned the land with quiet intensity. The officer in charge introduced himself curtly, his words clipped, his tone professional. He asked Brazil to lead them to the site. The rancher nodded, guiding them across the open land, his horse trailing reluctantly behind. When they arrived, the soldiers fell silent. For a long moment, they simply stared at the field, at the glittering fragments spread wide across the desert floor. Then, with brisk precision, they began their work. Men knelt in the dust, lifting pieces, testing their weight, bending them, striking them lightly with tools. Each fragment seemed to defy expectation. Some crumpled but sprang back instantly. Others resisted every attempt to break them. A few had odd symbols etched faintly on their surface, markings that no one could identify. The soldiers exchanged glances but said little. Their hands moved quickly, their eyes sharp, their expressions unreadable. Cameras clicked, capturing images of the debris. Notebooks filled with sketches and observations. Crates filled steadily as fragment after fragment was gathered, catalogued, and carried away. The field shrank slowly under their attention, the strange gleam fading as the earth was cleared piece by piece. Brazil watched in silence. He felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief, because the burden was no longer his alone. Unease, because the efficiency of the soldiers told him this was not ordinary. They knew what to do, as if they had done it before. The officer spoke to him only briefly, asking for the timeline of discovery, pressing him for details. Brazil gave what he could. The morning ride, the glint on the ground, the strange material. The officer nodded, wrote quickly, and moved on. There was no reassurance, no explanation, only the steady rhythm of recovery. By late afternoon, the trucks were heavy with crates. Soldiers covered the last of the fragments, brushing the soil smooth as though trying to erase any trace. The desert looked bare again, empty under the sun, but Brazil knew what had been there, and the silence left behind felt heavier than before. When the soldiers departed, their convoy trailing dust across the horizon, the ranch was quiet once more. But the quiet no longer felt like peace. It felt like secrecy. Brazel stood alone in the field, his hat pulled low against the sun, and wondered if he had just given away something the desert itself had not wanted to lose. That night, the sky over Roswell glittered as always. Stars crowded the heavens, steady and eternal. But for those who had seen the debris, the stars no longer felt distant. They felt closer, heavier, as though one of them had fallen to earth and left behind a mystery that would never be explained. Back in town, whispers had already begun. Soldiers had been seen, trucks had passed through. Something unusual had happened out on the ranch. People speculated quietly in diners, in barber shops, in the hushed corners of grocery stores. Some spoke of aircraft, others of secret tests, a few of something stranger. But the desert remained silent. The sky gave no answers. And in that silence, the storm was only beginning. The trucks rolled away from the Brazel Ranch in the fading light of evening, their canvas-covered loads rattling softly as they disappeared into the horizon. Dust trailed in their wake, rising into the air, and then settling back slowly over the desert floor. The land looked quiet again, as if nothing unusual had ever rested there. The sheep returned to grazing, tentative at first, then calmer once the field was cleared. But for Mac Brazel, the silence did not return to normal. It carried the weight of something unfinished. That night, the rancher sat on his porch, hat pulled low, the desert stretching endlessly before him. The stars glowed sharp and unwavering, the Milky Way running like a pale river across the black sky. Usually the sight brought him peace, but now it stirred unease. Somewhere up there, something had moved. Something had fallen, and whatever it was, it had now been taken away under military guard. In town, the whispers grew louder. People had seen soldiers driving through. Some claimed to have glimpsed the odd fragments in passing, silvery and bright in the sun. Others repeated rumors of a crash, not of a plane, but of something stranger, round and gleaming, unlike anything known. At the barber shop, men argued in low voices. At the diner, waitresses leaned in as customers speculated. What had Brazel found? Why had the army come so quickly? Why so much secrecy for what they said was a simple balloon? The first press release arrived swiftly, drafted from the offices of Roswell Army Airfield. It was brief, almost casual, yet its words struck like thunder across the nation. The Army, it said, had recovered a flying disc from a ranch north of Roswell. The phrase leapt from the page, bold and unambiguous. A flying disc. The newspapers wasted no time. By the next morning, headlines blared across the country. Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. For a moment, the ordinary town became the center of the extraordinary. Residents bought papers eagerly, eyes wide, voices hushed. Could it be true? Had something truly fallen from the skies, something not of this earth? The desert air seemed charged with possibility, as though the very soil had shifted beneath their feet. But as quickly as the news had spread, it was withdrawn. Within hours, a second statement replaced the first. The Army now claimed the recovered object was nothing more than a weather balloon. The fragments, they said, were simple equipment, misidentified in the excitement. The flying disc vanished from headlines, replaced by the balloon story. Photographs showed officers holding torn pieces of foil, sticks, and rubber, laid out neatly, as if to assure the public there was nothing to see. The effect was jarring. One day, a flying saucer, the next, a balloon. Some accepted the explanation with relief. The idea of visitors from the stars was too unsettling, too strange to linger on. Better to believe in balloons than in something beyond comprehension. But others remained unconvinced. The fragments they had glimpsed in Brazel's truck, The way soldiers had worked with such intensity, the speed with which the story had been silenced, none of it aligned with a simple balloon crash. In Roswell, the tension thickened, families whispered behind closed doors. Ranchers who had seen the debris firsthand said little, wary of drawing attention. The local paper printed the Army's official explanation, but the earlier headlines still echoed in memory. A flying disc, they had said, not once but clearly. For Brazel, the storm grew personal. Reporters hounded him with questions, neighbors watched him closely, and the military kept its gaze firmly on him. He spoke little, his words cautious, his demeanor uneasy. He had wanted nothing more than to tend his sheep and his land. Instead, he had become the reluctant center of a mystery that stretched far beyond his ranch. As days passed, the desert seemed to swallow the story. The soldiers departed, the fragments vanished into storage, the official explanation hardened into fact. But for those who had seen, those who had touched the strange material, the memory lingered. The fragments that crumpled and sprang back, the beams light as wood yet strong as steel, the odd symbols faintly inscribed, these could not be dismissed so easily. The desert itself seemed changed. Nights carried a heavier silence, as though the land remembered what had fallen. Stars glimmered above as always, but they no longer felt distant. They felt close, watchful, as though something beyond had briefly crossed the veil between heaven and earth and left its mark. In the homes of Roswell, radios carried other news, politics, music, the hum of a world moving forward. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, the whispers remained. Some swore they had seen lights in the sky on the night of the crash. Others claimed soldiers had spoken quietly of wreckage stranger than anything they had known. The official story stood, yet the unofficial one grew roots, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, preserved in memory like a secret waiting for the right time to emerge. And so the first chapter of the Roswell mystery closed, not with clarity, but with contradiction. A rancher's discovery, a press release of a flying disc, a retraction of a balloon. Between those lines lay a silence deeper than the desert itself. The wind moved softly across the plains, carrying with it the faint rustle of grass and the weight of secrets. The desert was quiet again, but not unchanged. The storm had not ended. It had only begun. The desert night was still. July had settled heavily across New Mexico, the heat of the day fading into coolness as shadows deepened and the land fell silent. The air carried the faint smell of dust and sage. In the distance, coyotes called, their cries long and hollow across the plains. Above, the stars glimmered in endless procession, bright and countless, stretching across a sky so clear it seemed like a vast window into forever. Roswell slept under that sky, its lights few and scattered, its streets quiet. Families had turned in after long days of work, radios switched off, children tucked into bed. The war was behind them, prosperity was ahead, and in the small routines of life, few expected anything unusual to interrupt the rhythm of the night. Yet something moved above that silence, unseen at first, then impossible to ignore. It began with a flicker. Some thought it was a shooting star, bright and brief, arcing downward in silence. But others saw more, a glow that lingered, pulsing faintly as it crossed the heavens. One witness later described it as a ball of light, brighter than any meteor, moving with intent. Another spoke of a low hum, so faint it was felt, more than heard, a vibration that seemed to press softly against the chest. The light traveled swiftly, descending toward the plains with unnatural precision. Unlike meteors that streaked and vanished, this glow shifted, slowed, as if controlled. It flared once, bright enough to cast shadows across the desert floor, then seemed to falter. Some swore they saw it break apart, fragments scattering like sparks before disappearing. Others insisted it remained whole, dipping low toward the earth before slipping behind ridges and vanishing from sight. In the silence that followed, the desert held its breath. Dogs barked in distant yards, horses stirred in corrals, uneasy. The stars continued to shine as though nothing had passed, but for those who had witnessed it, the sky no longer felt the same. Something had come down, something had crossed the thin veil between heaven and earth. At Foster Ranch, miles from town, Mac Brazel had not yet seen the debris. That would come in the morning, but that night, as he lay in his small ranch house, he heard his sheep stirring, restless and loud in their pens. He rose, stepping onto the porch, and scanned the dark. The animals shifted uneasily, their bleats carrying sharp in the cool air. Beyond them, the desert stretched silent, but faintly. Brazel thought he saw a glow fade behind distant hills. It was gone in a heartbeat, leaving only stillness. He returned inside, unsettled but unsure. Sleep came late, restless, broken by dreams of light. In town, a few others shared similar experiences. A couple driving home along a dirt road spoke of a sudden flash across the sky, startling enough to make them stop their car. A teenager lying awake by his window swore he saw a streak of light cut across the horizon, brighter and slower than any meteor. A farmer tending to a restless horse said he caught the tail end of something glowing, falling without sound. No single account was complete, but together they painted a picture of something extraordinary, moving silently through the New Mexico night. By morning, the desert bore the evidence. The field of debris, wide and glittering, scattered across Brazel's ranch. The animals refused to approach. The fragments shimmered strangely in the sun, and the silence of the land deepened. News of lights in the sky spread quietly, carried in soft voices over fences and through town streets. Most dismissed them as meteors, others as imagination, but for those who had seen with their own eyes, the memory lingered. The glow had been real. The hum had been felt, and the desert itself seemed to whisper of something more. The fall from the sky was the beginning, a moment small enough to be overlooked, yet vast enough to echo across generations. It passed in silence, in shadows, in whispers, but for Roswell the night would never be forgotten. The desert was not empty, the sky was not still, and from above, something had fallen quietly into the world of men. Morning spread slowly across the wide plains, the sky paling from violet to blue as the first rays of sunlight brushed the ridges. At Foster Ranch, Mac Brazel stirred from uneasy rest. His animals had been restless through the night, their bleats sharp, their movements jittery, as though some unseen presence lingered at the edges of the pasture. He stepped out into the cool dawn, boots pressing into soil that still held the chill of darkness, and he noticed again that strange scent in the air, metallic, sharp, like the faint trace of a struck nail. He saddled his horse, the leather creaking softly, and set out to check the northern fields. The land stretched empty before him, dotted with sage and scrub, the horizon glowing faintly with the promise of heat. The sheep followed at a distance, but when he reached the far pasture they stopped short, clustering together, bleating with uneasy voices. The horse shifted beneath him, ears pinned back, refusing to go further. Ahead, the ground shimmered oddly in the rising sun. Mac dismounted and walked forward. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. Shards of brightness scattered across the soil, glints of silver and white, as though stars had fallen in the night. He bent low and touched one. It was a sheet of strange material, thin as paper, light as air. He crumpled it in his fist, only to watch in astonishment as it unfolded itself again, smooth and unwrinkled. He frowned, picked up another. This one was stiff, like a beam, yet weighed almost nothing. He tried to snap it across his knee. It bent, resisted, then straightened unbroken. The material was unlike anything he had ever seen. The more he looked, the more he realized how vast the field was. Fragments lay everywhere, stretching hundreds of yards, some caught in tufts of grass, some tangled in the barbed wire fence, some embedded lightly in the earth, as if dropped from above rather than crashed with force. There was no crater, no burn mark, no smoke, just the quiet litter of something that had come apart in the sky and drifted silently to the desert floor. The horse refused to step closer. The sheep bawled in protest. Even the birds seemed absent, the morning strangely empty of song. Mac stood in the middle of it, hat pushed back, eyes scanning the impossible sprawl. He bent again, picking up what looked like a strip with faint marks etched along one side. They weren't letters, he knew, not numbers, just shapes, repeated, almost like symbols. He rubbed at them with his sleeve, but they faded, disappearing into the sheen of the material, as if they had never been there. Gathering several fragments, he loaded them carefully into a sack and rode back to the ranch house. At the kitchen table, his children watched in wonder. One bent the thin sheet into a knot, gasping as it straightened itself again. Another pressed a strut across the edge of the table, surprised when it flexed, but would not break. Their laughter filled the room for a moment, but Mac silenced them with a stern look. He told them not to speak of it beyond these walls. For 2 days he kept the discovery quiet. He returned to the field, collected more samples, and tried to make sense of them alone. But unease grew heavier with each visit. The debris did not rust, it did not dull in the sun. It simply gleamed, as if untouched by weather or time. The sheep continued to avoid the area. The horse too refused to pass near, and every night Mac lay awake, hearing again the restless stir of animals and remembering that faint glow he thought he had seen in the sky. But Roswell was a small town. Secrets did not stay buried long. Neighbors spoke of lights in the sky that week, of strange sounds that carried farther than thunder. In the barber shop, someone mentioned a rancher finding something odd out on the plains. In the diner, a waitress whispered that soldiers had been seen on the road north. Whispers carried, and soon Mac felt the weight of eyes upon him. Finally, uneasy and unsure, he gathered the fragments once more, loaded them into his truck, and set off for Roswell. The sun beat down on the road, dust rising behind the tires, the metallic pieces clinking faintly in their sack. He drove slowly, thinking of how to explain what he had found, how to describe material that seemed alive in its refusal to be broken. The truck rattled, the land stretched, and the weight of the mystery pressed heavier with every mile. When at last he arrived at the sheriff's office, he laid the fragments gently on the desk of George Wilcox. The sheriff was a man of stern composure, used to disputes over cattle and land, not matters that glittered with the strangeness of the sky. He lifted one fragment, bent it, pressed it with his knife, scowled when it resisted every test. He looked at Mac, then back at the material. His voice was low, deliberate. "This isn't ordinary," he said. "I think the army ought to see it." Mac nodded, relief and unease colliding in his chest. Whatever had fallen on his ranch was no longer his alone. Soon soldiers would come, trucks would arrive. The desert would once again hold its silence, but not its secret. That evening, as he drove back under the weight of gathering dusk, he looked to the horizon. Stars were just beginning to pierce the sky, steady and ancient, but to Mac Brazel, they no longer felt the same. They seemed closer, heavier, as if one of them had already fallen to earth and left its fragments scattered across his fields. The sheriff's office was a small place, dust in the window light, a calendar turned to July, a fan ticking softly as if counting the seconds of a slow afternoon. George Wilcox stood over the fragments a long time, jaw set, thumbs tracking the edges of a thin sheet that refused to keep the crease he pressed into it. When he finally lifted his eyes to Mac Brazel, there was neither alarm nor dismissal in his look, only the flat steadiness of a man who understood when something was above his pay grade. He picked up the telephone. The call to the army was not dramatic. It was brief, almost routine, a handful of plain words describing an unusual material found north of town. But even in that brevity, the message carried weight. At Roswell Army Airfield, the switchboard passed the call along, voices low, the name of the rancher repeated once, then set aside. A clerk wrote a few lines in a neat hand. a duty officer came down a corridor with the clipped pace of someone already building an inventory in his head. On the flight line, heat wavered above concrete. The base moved at its ordinary rhythm, mechanics under wings, a jeep coughing as it turned, an orderly pushing a cart stacked with files. Then the message reached the right desk, and the rhythm changed by a fraction, a request for transport. A camera kit signed out, notebooks, measuring tape, canvas sacks, labels, a small team assembled, an officer with eyes like leveled steel, 2 enlisted men with the quiet competence of those who have done many things without later speaking of them, a driver who knew every washed-out dip in the ranch roads. No one asked aloud what they would find. They gathered what they would need to prove the ordinary and to record the extraordinary, if it came to that. The jeep and the truck rolled through the gate with minimal fuss. Dust rose behind them in 2 pale pennants. As they left the base, the sound of their engines softened into the desert, swallowed by distance and light. Inside the cab, the officer turned the fragments Sheriff Wilcox had sent ahead, over in his hands. He tried the fold. He tried the press of a thumbnail. He listened for the ring that never came. Each time the material resisted him with the same mute refusal. He replaced it in the canvas bag and laced the mouth of the sack shut. Back in town, the sheriff cleared his desk and leaned back in his chair, the fan ticking through its lazy arc. Mac sat on a straight-backed chair near the wall, hat in his lap, watching dust drift through the sunbeam like slow snow. No one said much. The room felt like a waiting room in a story where no one quite knew the name of the doctor. When the convoy arrived, it did not crowd the sheriff's door with noise. The men entered quietly, a short exchange of introductions. The officer's gaze flicked to the crate, then to the rancher. "Show us," he said, and it was not a request. They stepped back into the brightness, and for a moment the street seemed brighter for the contrast. White heat on metal roofs, a boy with a hoop pausing to stare, a woman shading her eyes on a porch as the men climbed into their vehicles and turned north. The road to Foster Ranch unspooled like a ribbon of pale cloth. Prickly pear and yucca stood in their regular ranks, the land rolling away in folds of light and shadow. Mac led in his truck, the army jeep close behind, the canvas-covered stake bed bringing up the rear with the quiet, inevitable patience of logistics. They crossed a shallow arroyo and climbed again, the ranch house finally rising out of the heat shimmer with its windmill and tank, its fence lines drawing neat lines across the open. In the kitchen, the fragments on the table looked smaller than they had in town, dwarfed by the wide emptiness just beyond the door. The officer studied them again, but his eyes had already moved on to the horizon. "The field," he said. Mac nodded and led them out. The horse shied when they reached the first glitter. The sheep balked at the edge, as if a metal fence had been stretched across the ground. The army men took in the scene with no outward show of surprise. One of them knelt, slid a hand under a thin sheet, and lifted it the way a librarian might lift old paper. Another measured a span between 2 larger pieces and made a note. The officer stood still a long time, as if listening. Then the work began. Canvas sacks were opened and propped. Strips of paper with penciled numbers were tucked under stones to keep from blowing. A man with a camera worked down the field in a slow, methodical line, the shutter's small click swallowed instantly by the immensity of the day. Another man unspooled a length of twine and walked the arc of the scatter, staking it here and here, as if tracing the ghost of a path the object had traveled before it came apart. They moved without waste. Kneel, lift, examine, record, stow. Kneel, lift, examine, record, stow. The desert accepted their motions as it accepts wind, a temporary pattern etched on a surface that remembers more than it tells. Mac stood to one side, hat in both hands. He answered questions when asked. When did you first notice? How large an area? Had there been any fire, any smell, any sound? His answers were plain and few. He watched the sacks swell and the crates fill. He watched the glints on the ground diminish, a star field fading as dawn erases constellations. In the silence between the men's movements, he could hear his sheep out beyond the ridge, still uneasy, moving as a herd moves when it is following a logic not its own. Near the northern fence, the officer paused over a narrow strip with fine ridges along one edge, as regular as comb teeth. He ran a fingertip down their length, then lifted the strip and held it against the sky. For a moment, sunlight feathered through the ridges in evenly spaced lines, a music of light without sound. He set the piece gently into a sack and tied the mouth. No one spoke of what it was. The questions that mattered most were not asked out loud. The men did not argue. They did not speculate. They obeyed the old rules of work before conclusion: gather, measure, preserve. The land around them offered only heat and a sky so clear it felt like an answer that refused to be phrased. By late afternoon, the neatness of the field returned. Where there had been glints, there was grass. Where there had been struts and foils, there was only the memory of their shapes in the mind's eye. A final sweep produced a last handful of flecks, more dust than thing, and even these found their way into a labeled envelope. The officer walked the length one more time, then nodded. The men fitted the last crates into the truck's bed and secured the canvas. At the ranch house, the officer thanked Mac in a tone that contained neither gratitude nor dismissal, but the neutral acknowledgement of a task completed on one side and continuing on another. "We may need to speak again," he said. Mac nodded. He did not ask when. He did not ask where the materials would go. He had learned long ago that some questions only return silence. The convoy turned back toward town. Dust lifted and trailed them until the air settled without a trace. Evening slid across the land. A cicada rasped up from the mesquite. The windmill clicked. The ranch resumed its shape as if the day had been an interruption that had not rewritten it after all. But the shape was not the same, not really. In town, a few people had seen the vehicles pass. On porches, the talk was careful, the way talk becomes when it is still soft enough to be denied. A barber told a customer he'd heard the army had been asked to collect something. A grocer said a rancher had brought in scrap. A boy said he'd seen a sheet of metal that wasn't metal, folded and unfolded like a trick. The facts were small and unfastened. The feeling was larger than the facts. Night came down clean and absolute. Stars kindled one by one, and then all at once, somewhere beyond sight, a truck crossed the base gate and rolled into the light of a warehouse where the air smelled of oil and canvas and paper. Men heaved crates to the floor, stacked them in labeled rows, and signed their names beside numbers that meant something only to those who kept such ledgers. A camera case clicked open. Film canisters were removed, boxed, and carried into a room with a darker door. No announcements. No conclusions, only the quiet conversion of debris into evidence, of a field into a file. On the ranch, Mac sat on the porch and listened to the wind move through the wire. He had the sensation, stronger than before, that the sky was closer than it looked, that the distance between Earth and whatever watched the Earth could narrow without warning. It was not a frightening feeling, not quite. It was something heavier and more patient than fear. It felt like the beginning of a long silence that others would try to fill with words. The night deepened. The land cooled. In town, radios murmured low, and then one by one they clicked off. The sky remained. The sky always remained. And somewhere in the neat interior of a base where the lights burned late, a lid slid closed over a crate, and a pencil marked a number that would sleep inside a filing cabinet until someone remembered to ask it what it meant. The trucks that left Foster Ranch carried more than crates of unusual metal. They carried with them a secret that could not be named, a secret that weighed heavier than the dust that clung to their wheels. The convoy returned to Roswell Army Airfield with its cargo sealed beneath canvas. Inside, offices lit by single desk lamps, the fragments were examined again and again. Every officer who touched them found themselves repeating the same gestures Mac Brazel had made, bending, pressing, twisting, only to find the material always resisted, always returned, always defied. The questions grew quickly. What had fallen? Where had it come from? Could it be explained without shaking the foundations of what people believed about the sky above them? In the heat of July 7th, a decision was made. It was abrupt, perhaps careless, perhaps bold. A press release was drafted. It was short, almost plain in its language, but one phrase struck the world like lightning. A flying disc had been recovered on a ranch outside Roswell. The words left the typewriter, passed through approval, and landed in the hands of reporters. By evening they were already set in ink. The next morning, the headlines leapt across newspapers from New Mexico to Chicago to New York. Army captures flying saucer. The words sat bold above the fold, unmissable, impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, the silence of the desert spilled into the roar of the nation. Radios carried the story. Newspapers sold out. People stood on sidewalks reading aloud, voices rising with wonder and disbelief. Could it be true? Had something not of this earth really fallen from the sky and landed in the fields of a quiet rancher? In Roswell itself, excitement buzzed like electricity in the air. Shopkeepers read the headlines aloud to customers. Neighbors gathered on porches, passing papers between them, pointing at the words again and again. Children whispered to each other about little green men. Soldiers walking through town found themselves the subject of sudden stares. Even the desert seemed changed, as if the wind carried the echo of something new. But just as swiftly as the words had spread, they were taken back. By July 8th, less than 24 hours after the announcement, a second statement was issued. The object, the Army now insisted, was not a flying disc at all. It was a weather balloon, ordinary, explainable, nothing to wonder over. Photographs were arranged. Officers posed stiffly beside foil. Sticks and rubber remnants laid neatly on the floor. Cameras flashed. The message was clear. The extraordinary was now only the ordinary. The flying disc had been nothing more than misidentified balloon debris. The reversal landed like a stone in water, sending ripples of confusion outward. Some accepted it with relief. A flying saucer was a thought too large to carry into everyday life. Better to believe in balloons. Better to return to the comfort of cattle, crops, and routine. But others were unsettled. How could the Army make such a bold announcement one day, and so thoroughly retract it the next? Why had the first release been so specific, so confident? Why did the fragments described by Brazel and seen by others bear no resemblance to the weather balloon now displayed in photographs? The whispers grew louder. Some said the balloon story was a cover, a way to put the genie back in the bottle. Others suggested the Army had acted rashly with the first release and now scrambled to contain the mistake. In kitchens, in fields, in the quiet corners of Roswell's shops, the same questions circled: what had really fallen, and why was the story shifting so quickly? For Mac Brazel, the whirlwind was suffocating. Reporters knocked at his door, neighbors watched him with curiosity, and the Army kept him under its gaze. He had wanted only to tend his sheep, to repair his fences, to live quietly beneath the vast New Mexico sky. Instead, he found himself at the center of a storm that seemed to swell larger with every passing hour. The official explanation hardened with repetition. Weather balloon, weather balloon. The photographs in newspapers showed neat debris, ordinary and unremarkable. But those who had seen the fragments firsthand, the strange foil, the weightless beams, the unbreakable sheets, knew the pictures told only part of the story. By the end of that week, Roswell returned to its slow rhythm. Radios hummed again with music and baseball scores. Children ran through sprinklers, laughing in the heat. The desert wind moved across sage and sand, carrying the same old sense of dust and sun. But beneath the ordinary, something had shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it would not stop growing. The silence of the desert seemed different now. It was no longer only the silence of wide, empty land. It was the silence of questions unanswered, of files locked away, of a story begun but not finished. In that silence, Roswell's mystery took root. The headlines faded from the front pages. The official balloon story closed the case, at least on paper. But in the minds of those who had glimpsed the fragments, in the dreams of those who had watched lights cross the sky, the mystery lingered. It lingered in the soft bleating of sheep that still avoided a certain field, in the creak of Brazel's porch as he sat under starlight, in the eyes of soldiers who never quite said what they had seen. The desert holds memory well. Winds sweep the surface, but the land remembers. And though the crates had been carried away, though the army had sealed its words behind retraction, the desert itself whispered what it had witnessed. Something had fallen, something had been gathered, and though the nation was told to forget, Roswell never truly did. The stars came out again, as they always did, brilliant, eternal, silent. Yet to those who had read the first headlines, they seemed different now, heavier, closer, as if one had fallen already, and others might follow. The desert was quiet again, but the quiet had changed. The Foster Ranch lay wide and quiet under the New Mexico sun, its pastures stretching far into the distance where low ridges cut the horizon. For years, William Mack Brazel had worked this land with little thought for anything beyond its ordinary demands. The days were marked by chores, mending wire fences, tending to sheep, watching the sky for rain. He was not a man who sought attention. His world was measured in the rhythm of labor, in the weight of tools in his hand, in the familiar sounds of livestock moving across the dry soil. The summer of 1947 had been no different, until the morning he rode out to check his herd and found the field of debris scattered like the remains of something unimaginable. In the quiet dawn, the fragments had glittered. He had gathered them hesitantly, examining their odd resilience, their weightless strength. But the more he looked, the less sense they made. No aircraft he knew could break apart in such a way, leaving no fire, no crater, no scar upon the earth. It was as though the sky itself had fractured, and its shards lay scattered in the sagebrush. At first, Brazel kept the secret close. He stored several pieces in a crate beneath his table, pushing it out of sight. But even hidden, the fragments seemed to press on him. At night, when the wind rattled through the house, he thought of them gleaming silently in the dark. The sheep remained uneasy near the field. His horse avoided the area, snorting and stamping whenever he drew close. And in town, whispers began to circulate of strange lights, of soldiers moving with quiet urgency. The rancher found himself caught between silence and disclosure. He was no storyteller, no man given to fancy, but the debris demanded explanation, and he knew he could not provide it alone. After days of uneasy deliberation, he gathered several pieces, loaded them into his truck, and drove into Roswell. The road stretched long and empty, dust rising behind the wheels, the fragments clinking softly in the sack beside him. At the sheriff's office, he laid the material before George Wilcox. The sheriff studied them, his brow furrowed, his knife pressed hard against an edge that would not yield. "This isn't ordinary," he said at last, his voice measured. "The army ought to see it." Those words marked the turning point. Until then, the mystery had been Brazel's alone, a secret held between himself, his land, and the restless silence of his animals. Now it would spread outward, beyond his control. When the soldiers came, they worked with precision. They combed the field, gathering every fragment, photographing, cataloging, boxing the strange debris until the ground lay bare again. Brazel watched, silent, uneasy. He answered questions when asked, repeating the simple truth. He had found the material scattered across his pasture, unlike anything he had ever seen. But as the days passed, the attention turned heavier. Reporters arrived, eager for words he did not want to give. Neighbors watched him with new curiosity. The army pressed him, urging caution. urging silence. For a man who had lived quietly beneath the wide desert sky, it was suffocating. The first headlines had called it a flying disc, the retraction, a weather balloon. But in his memory, the fragments remained what they had always been: strange, unbreakable, unyielding, and utterly foreign to anything his hands had known before. At night, sitting on his porch, he felt the weight of it. The desert wind moved across the land, the stars glimmered as they always had, but the silence was no longer ordinary. It was the silence of something hidden, something taken away, something he was not meant to speak of. The ranch had returned to its rhythm. The sheep grazed, the fences sagged and were mended again. The days rose and fell in heat and quiet. But for Brazel the land had changed. The field where the fragments once lay seemed different now, as if the earth itself carried the memory of what had touched it. The sheep still balked at its edges, their instincts refusing what memory alone could not erase. In town he kept his words brief, his eyes down. He had no interest in becoming the center of a story larger than himself. Yet the story had chosen him, and it clung to him like dust that would not wash away. The desert was wide, the sky eternal, but both had been pierced, and Mac Brazel, a man of sheep and fences, found himself carrying the burden of a mystery that belonged not just to him, but to history itself. The silence lingered, the sky was not empty, and the rancher's discovery had become the seed of a legend. The sheriff's words had lingered with him. The army ought to see it. Simple, steady, but final. Once spoken, the path ahead was no longer his to shape. Brazel had carried the fragments into town with the hope that someone might explain them, that a voice of authority would provide a clean answer. Instead, the mystery had grown larger, heavier, and now stretched beyond the fences of his land. When the soldiers had come, he had watched them gather every shard, every strip, every glinting piece of the strange debris that had startled his herd and unsettled his nights. They had worked with an efficiency that was neither curious nor careless, only determined. Now the field lay bare, the glitter gone, the earth plain again. Yet, in its emptiness, Brazel felt the weight of something missing. In the days that followed, the silence around him did not ease. It thickened. Neighbors stopped by with careful voices, asking how the ranch fared, circling their real questions like coyotes pacing outside a firelight. He answered with shrugs, with vague words, keeping the truth folded inside him. The children, too, carried the secret uneasily, their eyes darting whenever conversation bent toward the stars. Then the press arrived. At first, it was a trickle, a single reporter, curious, notebook in hand, shoes coated quickly with dust, as he stepped from his car and asked if this was the ranch where it had happened. Brazel did not like the phrasing, where it had happened, as though something final, something grand, had taken place there, when to him it was only a field that had been littered with fragments he could not name. But the questions came quickly. What had he seen? How had he found it? Did it glow? Did it hum? Was it metal? Was it cloth? Was it wood? Was it something else entirely? The man's pencil scratched at the paper, as though words could cage what the desert had released. Brazel answered cautiously, plain descriptions of sheets that bent and returned, beams light yet strong, symbols faint and fleeting. He offered no conclusions. He had none. Still, the story grew. More reporters followed, more questions pressed. His name now appeared in papers he had never seen, his ranch described in sentences that twisted his simple account into something larger, stranger. He read his own words carried back to him, reshaped into headlines that spoke of flying discs, of crashed saucers, of mysteries that had little to do with the quiet he had known in that field. The army's presence did not ease the pressure. Soldiers returned, not to gather debris this time, but to watch, to listen, to ensure the story did not spread further than it ought. Their questions were sharper, their voices less curious and more commanding. They asked whom he had spoken to, what exactly he had told the sheriff, what pieces he still might have hidden away. He told them the truth, that he had given them all he had found, that the field was bare, that he wanted nothing more than to return to his sheep. But still they pressed. Still their eyes searched his small home, their boots scuffed his porch, their presence lingered at the edges of his land. In town, the contrast was sharper still. One morning, a newspaper headline shouted that the army had captured a flying saucer. The next, another insisted it was only a weather balloon. The swing between wonder and dismissal left Brazel in a whirl of contradiction. He had seen the fragments. He had touched them. They were no balloon. And yet the words of the papers, the voices of the soldiers carried a weight he could not resist. He found himself repeating the balloon story when pressed, the words tasting bitter on his tongue, but easing the pressure of the questions. Perhaps, he told himself, it was safer that way. Perhaps silence was a kind of shield, but at night, under the wide desert stars, he knew the truth was not so easily contained. The memory of the field remained. The sheep still refused its ground. The fragments still gleamed in his mind, indestructible, inexplicable. The rancher's discovery had been simple: a ride across the pasture, a glint in the grass, a handful of strange debris. But its weight had grown unbearable. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to newspapers, to soldiers, to whispers that crossed state lines. And yet, in the quiet of his porch, he carried it still, heavy and unspoken. The desert seemed to know. Its silence stretched longer, its nights deeper. Even the wind brushing across wire and sage seemed to murmur of secrets withheld. Brazel sat with it, a man pulled unwilling into history, a rancher bound to a mystery that refused to leave. The sky above glittered as always, bright, eternal, unmoved. But to him, it had changed. It was no longer simply sky. It was a vault, a question, a weight pressing down. One star, he thought, had already fallen, and the silence below it would never be the same. The desert was not empty. The silence was not ordinary, and the rancher carried the burden of both. The press release had struck like thunder, and the retraction had followed just as swiftly. One day, Mac Brazel's name sat in print beside words like flying disc. The next, his discovery was folded into the explanation of a weather balloon. In the span of a single week, he had become both witness and fool, the man who had touched the extraordinary, and the man who had mistaken the ordinary. Neither description was one he had sought. The reporters came to his door again, pencils sharp, questions sharper. They asked him to describe the debris, to tell them whether it shone, whether it hummed, whether it could have come from the sky. Some asked if he had seen a disk, if he had glimpsed a body, if the desert had revealed more than metal. He shook his head at each. No, he had seen no craft. No, he had seen no beings. Only fragments, scattered wide, unlike anything he had known before. But the words were not his alone anymore. The army spoke for him. The newspapers rewrote him. His descriptions bent into the shape of their headlines, his silence filled with their speculation. Where he had said fragments, they wrote saucer. Where he had said strange, they wrote alien. Where he had said nothing at all, they filled the gap with invention. Soon, the pressure grew unbearable. Soldiers returned to his ranch, not with crates and cameras this time, but with questions weighted with command. They asked again and again whether he had told anyone else, whether he had hidden any pieces. They pressed him to repeat the balloon explanation, to stand by it, to let the matter close. He was a rancher, not a politician, not a soldier. He had no taste for conflict, no desire to argue with authority, and so, when pressed, he nodded. Yes, it could have been a balloon. Yes, perhaps he had been mistaken. But the words did not sit easily. They lodged in his throat, heavy, untrue. Each night, sitting on his porch, he remembered the feel of the fragments in his hands, the way they bent and returned, the way they resisted every test. Balloons did not behave that way. Wood and foil did not shimmer with that strange life, yet the official story demanded his agreement, and so he gave it, reluctantly, quietly, with eyes lowered. In town, Some believed him, others did not. Some whispered that he had been pressured, that soldiers had stood on his porch until he bent to their words. Others said he had simply misunderstood what he found. But either way, the name of Brazel lingered, attached forever to a mystery he never wanted to carry. He tried to return to work. Fences sagged again, sheep wandered, the pump needed mending. But even in the quiet rhythm of chores, the weight followed him. Every time he passed the field where the fragments had lain, he saw them glittering in memory. The sheep still avoided it, their instincts refusing what the earth itself seemed to hold. He could not ride past without remembering. Neighbors continued to visit, some asked gently, some pressed more sharply. He learned to give half answers, to shrug, to say little. He found himself tired, not from labor, but from the endless repetition of silence. He wished for nothing more than to be left alone, to be forgotten, to let the desert swallow the story. But the desert did not. The newspapers moved on, shifting to other headlines, other events, but the story of Roswell did not fade. It lingered in whispers, in half-remembered conversations, in files that were stamped and locked away. Brazel remained at the center of it, though he wished only to step aside. He was not a man built for notoriety. He was a man built for ranchland and sky, for the simple rhythm of work. But history had pressed him into a role he could not refuse. In the months that followed, he grew quieter still. Some said he looked older, his shoulders heavier, his gaze more guarded. He spoke rarely of the field, and when he did, his words were cautious, his voice subdued. The story had been taken from him, reshaped by others, and what remained was no longer his to tell. Yet in the silence of his own thoughts, the memory endured. He could not forget the fragments in his hands, the impossible strength, the strange symbols fading like whispers. He could not forget the way his animals had refused the field, the way the land itself had seemed to hold its breath. These things were real to him, undeniable, etched into his days. The desert knew, the stars above knew, and he knew, but he carried it alone. The newspapers had moved on, the soldiers had locked their files, the world had returned to its rhythm, but for the rancher, the discovery had left a mark that time could not erase. The silence lingered still, the sky pressed heavy, and Mac Brazel bore the weight of both, quietly, endlessly beneath the eternal desert stars. The weeks after the retraction unspooled like a slow rope, dusty, frayed at the edges, drawn through the hands of ordinary days. The headlines cooled. The reporters drifted off toward other storms. Trucks no longer climbed the ranch road with their canvas backs and chalked inventory numbers. It might have seemed to anyone glancing from a distance that Roswell had folded itself neatly back into routine, but routine had been altered by degrees, too fine to measure on paper. Mac Brazel felt it first in the small things. The quiet at dawn was not the same quiet. It had a grain to it, a texture like sand under the tongue. He caught himself listening for the sheep, even when the pen was still, as if expecting a ripple of unease his animals could not fully shake. He walked the fence lines and felt, without looking, when he was coming near the field that had once glittered with debris. The way a body knows a scar without touching it, he tried to work past it. There were chores that could not wait for mysteries. A wind-torn length of wire to staple, a pump to prime, a gate to plane where the hinge had swollen with rain. In the doing, he found brief reprieve, the way habit can hush thought. Yet even the tools in his hands seemed to remember. A hammer lifted, a nail set, a pause as some small corner of his mind turned again to thin sheets that bent and refused to remain bent, to struts that weighed less than their shadows. Neighbors learned his new quiet and met it with their own. They spoke of cattle prices, a late frost in the orchard country, a preacher who'd come through with a sermon that could carry past the door. They did not speak, not often and not directly, of the field. When they did, they softened their words the way men soften the names of illnesses you ever hear any more about, they ever say what it truly was. He would shake his head, not in dismissal, but in a kind of mercy, sparing them the tangle of a story that would not hold still. On certain afternoons he'd drive as far as the road would carry him and sit with the engine off, no sound but the slow tick of cooling metal. The land's distances steadied him, the clean line where the sky met the rim of earth, the math of rows in a plowed field far to the south, the geometry of windmills placed for water and not for beauty. The desert offered itself like a ledger, columns of light, columns of shade, entries balanced by sun and time. And still, within that neatness he could not balance the page of what he had seen. There were rumors he heard, and did not keep, rumors of things beyond his gate. That someone at the base had moved boxes at night, that a man in a distant office had signed his name on a paper that did not describe what was inside those boxes. That film had been carried east, where rooms were dim and doors were thicker. He learned to let such talk pass through him, like wind through wire. He had no use for stories he could not tend, could not set hooves to, could not mend with a handful of staples and a length of barbed strand. He saw Sheriff Wilcox only a few times after that summer. Their talk was practical. The sheriff aged a little around the eyes, in those small exchanges on a sidewalk by a truck bed, in the shared pause of men who knew one another's work. There was a current of respect that asked for nothing and returned the same. Neither of them pushed at the past, neither of them needed to. At night, the stars continued their old obedience. They rose, they wheeled, they burned cold. If Mac looked long enough, the familiar shapes gathered, the handle, the belt, the arrow bright along its line. On some nights he left the porch and walked out into the dark until the house was a square of softer black behind him. Out there, the sky pressed down with a clarity that did not comfort. It was too clean, too exact, the way a truth can be exact and still keep its deeper part hidden. He spoke little of the fragments as the years leaned forward. When he did, his words were plain and few, and he kept an old care in the telling. The world beyond the ranch had made its story. He would not argue with it. But in his own mind, the shape of the thing remained unchanged. He had found material that was not like other material. He had carried it in his hands. He had watched soldiers lift it with a delicacy they did not waste on scrap. He had seen the field emptied, and he had heard, afterward, the way silence can thicken when a place remembers. Work was the salvation he had, work and weather, a season of good grass, a season of thin, years when lambing went easy, years when coyotes pressed harder than traps could answer. He learned again, as he had known before, that a rancher's faith is not in explanations but in mornings, each one arriving, whether or not a man deserves it. Once, late in autumn, he walked the north pasture under a sky the color of old tin. Geese stitched their vers along a high corridor of air. He stepped into the edge of the old field without thinking and felt that flicker in the body that comes when memory is triggered by place. He stopped. The grass had grown back. The wind had washed the ground 1,000 times. No glint, no shard, no sign, only the knowing. He knelt and pressed his palm to the soil. It was cool. It was ordinary. It held, as all soil holds, the sum of what had fallen on it and the promise of what might rise. In town, people told the Roswell story to newcomers the way towns tell any story the outside world has chosen for them, with a wry smile, with a shrug, with a drift between pride and patience. Some swore the army had found exactly what it said, a balloon. Others swore that the first words printed had been the truest ones. Most let the thing exist in that wider American drawer labeled maybe. Mac did not set the terms for any of it. He shook hands. He bought nails. He drove back out where the road narrowed and names fell away. There are men who shine in the center of a tale, and men whose lives are the ground the tale crosses. Mac Brezel was the latter. The story ran over him the way rain runs over stone. It polished certain surfaces, carved a line here and there, and kept moving toward its own mouth. He did not chase it. He did not keep it. He returned as he could to the measure of days that had been his before. If anyone asked what he believed, he might have said only that belief was a large word for a man with sheep to count and weather to read. He believed in the stubbornness of wire and the ways wind finds its paths whether you approve or not. He believed in work, and he believed, without announcing it, that the land remembers what it must. Toward the end of that season, a hard wind came through and scoured the ranch clean. It rattled the windows in their frames and set the windmill talking all night. By morning, the air had the look it sometimes has after weather, new as if washed. Mac stepped out and stood a while. He watched the light take hold of each familiar thing. The tank, the gate, the pen. He felt the old steadiness return in that sparse way the desert gives it. No promises, only proof. He saddled his horse and rode the north line. When the field came near, the horse did not balk. It hesitated, perhaps a breath longer than it might have elsewhere, then moved on. Mac did not stop. He tipped his hat against the sun and let the miles do their work. Behind him, the house held its shape. Ahead of him, the fence drew a chalk mark on the day. Overhead, the sky did what the sky does, vast and exact and untroubled by the names men give to what passes through it. Somewhere, in a file cabinet that did not live on any ranch, a crate number slept beside a date. Somewhere, a photograph of a field of glitter sat under a thin sheet of paper. Those were other men's keepings. The desert kept its own. By evening, he was back on the porch, boots off, hat on the rail, the last light turning the tank to copper. The sheep settled. The wind fell. He listened for whatever the silence would say, and heard only what a man hears when he has worn himself honest, the small, pure sounds of a day finishing its work. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and the rancher, who had once lifted a fragment that would not remember the pressure of his hand, let the night take the weight from his shoulders and set it gently where the land puts such things, down deep under grass, under years, under the calm, watchful stars. The Roswell Army airfield stood a few miles outside town, its runways stretching across the desert like chalk marks against sand. In July of 1947, it was home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world trusted with nuclear weapons. The men stationed there carried a weight of responsibility few civilians could imagine. To them, security was not just a word, it was a constant state of being, an expectation woven into every step, every salute, every sealed envelope that crossed a desk. When word reached the base that a rancher had delivered fragments of something strange to the sheriff, the machinery of procedure began to turn. Orders passed quietly from office to office. Clerks carried files with deliberate haste. Vehicles were fueled, cameras checked, notebooks issued. By the time the sun tilted westward, a small convoy of trucks and jeeps was already headed toward Foster Ranch, their engines humming low against the open air. For the soldiers, it was not unusual to be sent out into the desert. Training exercises, crash recoveries, weather balloon retrievals, all were part of routine life. Yet there was something about the urgency of this order that set it apart. The officer in charge said little, only that they were to secure all material, photograph everything, and report back without delay. The men exchanged quiet glances but asked no questions. Questions were seldom rewarded. At the ranch they found the field as Brazel had described. Glittering fragments lay scattered wide, hundreds of feet across. Thin sheets of something silvery caught in the barbed wire. Rods jutted from the soil like ribs exposed to the sun. The men knelt, lifted, tested. The pieces bent but sprang back, folded but would not tear. Some were cool to the touch even under the desert sun. A photographer clicked frame after frame, the sharp snick of the shutter the only sound beyond the breeze, and the sheep bleating nervously in the distance. They worked with precision. Each fragment was logged, numbered, and packed away. The officer wrote brisk notes in his ledger, his pencil scratching across the paper. Soldiers filled crate after crate, carrying them back to the waiting trucks. Dust clung to their boots, sweat beaded under their caps, but their movements never slowed. They were trained to secure, to record, to erase traces when required. By evening, the field looked empty again. Grass bent where crates had been dragged. Footprints marked the soil, but the strange glints were gone. To anyone passing by, it would have appeared as ordinary pasture. Yet to those who had walked it, touched it, the silence now felt heavier. They knew they had carried something unusual into their trucks, and unusual things in the army were not discussed. They were classified. Back at the base, the crates were unloaded under guard. They were carried not into open hangars but into sealed storerooms, their contents inventoried in longhand, pages stamped, signatures added at the bottom. The fragments were examined under stronger light, tested against blades, burned against flame, bent against pressure. Each time, the result was the same. The material resisted explanation. Too strong, too light, too unyielding. Reports were drafted, but not shared widely. Only a handful of officers saw the notes. Each page carried the stamp, 6 grit. Copies were limited. Distribution was tight. The fewer eyes on the fragments, the fewer voices that might carry questions. And yet, despite the secrecy, a curious decision was made. On July 8th, the base issued a press release. It spoke plainly, almost casually, stating that a flying disc had been recovered near Roswell. The words leapt from type to radio, spreading across the country in hours. The Army, the most disciplined, most controlled of institutions, had just told the world it had captured a flying saucer. The effect was immediate. Newspapers printed bold headlines. Telephones rang endlessly in offices from Roswell to Washington. For a moment, the mystery of the fragments was not hidden but shouted to the nation. Inside the base, not all agreed with the decision. Some officers frowned, puzzled at the recklessness of speaking so openly. Others suspected the announcement was a misstep, a premature report made before orders from higher up had reached Roswell. In the Army, timing mattered, and timing had been lost. The retraction came quickly. Within a day, another statement replaced the first. The fragments, the Army now explained, were from a weather balloon. The photographs showed foil, sticks and rubber, laid neatly before the camera. The flying disc was gone from the story, replaced by a simple error. But those who had touched the fragments knew better. They had felt the resilience of the thin sheets, seen the markings that faded under light, watched the beams bend and resist. What they had carried from the ranch was not what now appeared in photographs. Yet their voices stayed quiet. Orders were orders, and secrecy was their duty. Roswell itself stirred with unease. Civilians whispered that the Army had said too much, then too little, then nothing at all. Ranchers spoke of soldiers moving swiftly, of crates loaded with unusual care. Some claimed to have glimpsed pieces of debris unlike anything the newspapers now displayed. But official words carried weight, and the official word was balloon. The desert returned to silence, the base to its routines. Planes lifted into the sky, engines roared, soldiers drilled in the heat. But beneath the surface, the fragments remained, locked in storerooms, logged in files, carried eventually to destinations unknown. The military's response had been swift, precise, contradictory. It had opened the door to wonder, then slammed it shut. Yet the silence that followed did not erase what had been seen. It only deepened the mystery. The desert remembered, the soldiers remembered, and though the press release had faded, the fragments still lay heavy in their crates, waiting in the shadows of secrecy. The press release had gone out like a spark, and the retraction followed like a bucket of water poured too quickly. On July 8th, the world was told of a flying disc. On July 9th, the world was told of a balloon. The swing was so abrupt that even in small towns, even in quiet kitchens and barbershops, people spoke of it with raised brows. Mistakes did happen.
Yes.
But the Army was not known for clumsy words. At Roswell Army Airfield, the mood tightened. Officers spoke less freely in corridors. Doors that had once stood ajar now closed with deliberate care. Files moved quickly from desk to desk, stamped and signed, then locked away. For the men who had handled the fragments, there was no further discussion. They had been told what to say and what not to say. In Washington, cables arrived swiftly. Reports were summarized, condensed, rewritten. Phrases like unidentified debris were reshaped into meteorological equipment. Phrases like flying disc were crossed out, replaced with terms safer, duller, forgettable. Senior officers demanded clarity, yet clarity was exactly what none could provide. The fragments resisted explanation. Too strong to be foil, too light to be steel, too strange to be wood or cloth. Still, the official story was set, a balloon. The order passed down: close the matter, lock the files, redirect questions, and above all, avoid fueling speculation. The United States had just emerged from a war that had stretched across continents. It could not afford whispers of objects from beyond the earth. The Cold War was beginning to take shape. Suspicion of foreign powers simmered. The last thing needed was talk of flying discs in New Mexico. At the ranch, Brazel felt the pressure more directly. Reporters pressed him for words, notebooks open, pencils ready. He found soldiers at his door, their questions sharp but polite in tone that barely masked command. He was urged to repeat the balloon story, urged to support the official line. He had no desire for conflict, no interest in fame. He repeated what they asked, though the words weighed heavy. Neighbors noticed his change. Once talkative enough about weather and cattle, he grew quieter, guarded. When asked directly, he would say little more than that the army had explained it. Yet those who knew him sensed he carried something unspoken. His children, too, recalled the unease. They had seen the fragments twist and straighten in their own hands. They had watched their father gather them into sacks. To them, the words "weather balloon" rang hollow. At the base, the soldiers who had worked the recovery found themselves silent as well. To comrades, they said only that they had been ordered to secure debris. If pressed, they described foil, sticks, and rubber, the language of the retraction. Their memories of the strange resistance, the odd markings, the quiet shimmer of the field, they kept those thoughts to themselves. In the army, silence was discipline, and discipline was survival. In Washington, the files multiplied, copies were made, redacted, stamped. Some went to the Pentagon, others to intelligence offices, a handful perhaps farther still, to agencies that dealt in secrets too heavy for public air. Each page carried the same stamps, the same signatures, the same weight of silence. To those who filed them, they were papers like any other. To those who had seen the fragments, they were fragments of truth hidden in plain words. The newspapers printed the balloon story with photographs. Officers posed stiffly beside debris, arranged neatly on a floor, foil spread, sticks aligned, rubber folded into place. The images were meant to close the matter, but to those who had glimpsed what Brazel had carried into town, they looked staged, unconvincing. The fragments they remembered did not behave like that foil. The beams they had touched did not resemble those sticks. The weight of contradiction lingered. In Roswell, townspeople spoke more quietly now. In the cafes, the talk shifted back to crops and baseball scores, but always, beneath the surface, the questions remained. In the barber shop, someone would mention the first press release, flying disc, and voices would lower, heads would shake. The retraction had not erased the memory. It had sharpened it. The desert, too, held its silence. The field on Brazel's ranch looked ordinary once again, grass swaying lightly in the breeze. Yet those who had been there knew what it had held. Sheep still avoided the place, birds circled wide, and Brazel, passing by, felt the memory each time, like a weight pressing down through the soles of his boots. In Washington, silence was strategy. In Roswell, silence was survival. Between them stretched miles of desert and a story that refused to settle. The army had responded with speed, with precision, with secrecy, but in doing so, it had left behind a trail of contradiction. One headline said, "Disc," another said, "Balloon." Between them lay the truth, unspoken, waiting. The sky was not empty, the silence was not ordinary, and the military's response had only deepened the mystery. The desert wind moved as it always did, brushing across wire fences, lifting dust in small spirals, rattling the dry seed heads of grass. Life in Roswell seemed to settle again into its ordinary rhythm. Children rode bicycles down Main Street. Radios hummed with baseball games and swing music. Trains passed slowly through the station, carrying cattle, feed, and travelers bound for other places. Yet beneath the calm, something had shifted. The story of the fragments had been opened, then shut again too quickly and too loudly for anyone to forget. One day the army had said flying disc, the next it had said weather balloon. Between those two words, an entire town now lived in uneasy silence. At the Foster Ranch, Mac Brazel carried the weight most heavily. He had spoken cautiously to reporters, his words reshaped in their papers. He had repeated the army's line, though it never matched the memory of the field. Neighbors noticed his unease, his quietness. They saw the way his children looked at him when the subject came up, as if they too carried fragments of the secret in their small hands. In town, the talk grew softer, but it did not vanish. Men leaning in barber chairs still asked what had truly fallen. Waitresses pouring coffee still listened to whispered theories. Some said the army had acted rashly, too quick to announce, too quick to retract. Others said the first announcement had been the truth, and the balloon explanation only a cover. A few shook their heads and insisted it was all confusion, nothing more. But even they said it in voices that betrayed doubt. The military's presence was felt in quiet ways. Jeeps passed along dusty roads at hours when few traveled. Soldiers stood watch at the edges of certain offices, their eyes scanning without expression. Residents who spoke too openly sometimes received polite visits, reminders to keep speculation to themselves. Nothing harsh, nothing forceful, but enough to nudge silence into place. Roswell was small, and small towns remembered. At the base, files grew thicker. Reports were typed and carbon copied, stamped secret, folded into folders that would be carried into cabinets and drawers. The fragments themselves, those strange sheets and rods, were moved farther from view, placed under guard, destined for storage in facilities beyond the desert. Some said they went east, to labs in distant cities. Others said they were flown by night, to bases where no civilian could follow. No one in Roswell knew for certain, and perhaps the soldiers themselves did not. The official story grew firm. Weather balloon, simple, ordinary, unremarkable. Photographs of foil and sticks were printed again in papers. A general held a press conference, his voice steady as he pointed to rubber and wood. The message was clear. Nothing extraordinary had fallen in New Mexico. Nothing that should trouble sleep, and yet sleep was troubled. For those who had seen the fragments with their own eyes, the balloon story rang hollow. They remembered the strange resilience, the impossible lightness, the markings that faded in sunlight. They remembered the field, glittering like spilled starlight. The photographs in the papers showed nothing of that. The contradiction lay heavy, unspoken but alive. Years later, some of those men would recall their silence. They would speak, cautiously at first, then more freely, when time had softened the edges of secrecy. They would describe the material that defied their strength, the way soldiers had moved with urgency, the way the army had shifted its words in less than a day. But in 1947, those voices remained quiet. In 1947, silence was expected. The town learned to live with that silence. It became a background hum, like the wind through telephone wires or the rattle of trains passing in the night. It was there, always but seldom named. Parents warned their children not to ask too many questions. Shopkeepers served coffee with a smile and kept their opinions to themselves. Roswell continued, outwardly ordinary, inwardly marked by the knowledge that something unusual had crossed its skies and landed in its fields. In the larger world, the story faded quickly. Other headlines replaced it: politics, sports, foreign tensions. The Roswell incident slipped into the margins, remembered only by those who had lived it, dismissed by most who had only read the balloon explanation. Yet in the desert, the memory remained strong. Brazel himself withdrew further. He carried on with his work, tending to sheep, repairing his ranch, walking the lines of fence under the weight of the sun. But he avoided reporters, avoided talk, avoided the eyes of neighbors who asked with too much curiosity. The fragments were gone, but the burden remained. He had become part of a story larger than himself, and he did not want it. The army had secured what it wished: silence, secrecy, control, but in doing so, it had also planted doubt, and doubt has a way of lasting longer than certainty. The desert remembered, the townspeople remembered. And though the official files were locked, the legend had already begun to take root. The desert wore its silence well. By late July, the land around Roswell looked no different than it had before: sunlight on pale grass, the faint shimmer of heat, the chorus of insects in the long afternoons. Yet to those who lived there, the silence no longer felt ordinary. It felt instructed, shaped, as though a weight had been laid upon the town and pressed into its days. The army had spoken twice, and in those two voices the matter had been set. First, a flying disc, then a balloon. The second voice was the one meant to last. Files were written in that voice, photographs staged in that voice, newspapers filled with it, until the first voice seemed like a mistake, a slip of the tongue too quickly corrected. Inside Roswell Army Airfield, the fragments were gone from view. The storerooms that had held them now stood empty, their contents carried east under guard, loaded into aircraft at night. Men in uniform moved crates with deliberate care, securing them under canvas and rope, signing papers with tidy signatures before handing them off. Where the fragments went after that, few at Roswell ever knew. Some said Wright Field in Ohio, where new materials were tested. Others whispered of laboratories with doors thicker than vaults, guarded by silence as much as by steel. Wherever they went, they left behind only questions. For the soldiers who had touched them, the orders were clear: speak only of balloons, forget the rest. They did not argue. Silence was not difficult for men trained to follow commands, but in their memories the fragments remained, the way the foil returned to shape, the way the rods bent but refused to break, the faint markings that seemed to vanish under sunlight. They remembered, even as their words stayed aligned with orders. In Washington, the files settled into cabinets, labeled neatly, stamped secret. Clerks moved them into drawers alongside hundreds of others. Reports of aircraft, reports of tests, reports of incidents that would never be spoken of outside those rooms. The Roswell case became a file among files, its words flattened into the ordinary language of balloon, meteorological debris. Yet beneath those words, the memory of the first press release, the one that had dared to say flying disc, remained stubborn, refusing to vanish. In Roswell itself, life resumed, though never quite as before. The townspeople spoke less freely, especially in public. Some still whispered of lights in the sky, of soldiers moving by night, of crates carried under tarpaulins. But the whispers thinned as the weeks passed, covered by the louder rhythms of chores and seasons. Crops needed tending, livestock needed care, and the world's attention had already turned elsewhere. Still, in the quiet moments, in barber shops, on porches, at the edge of fields, the questions lingered. Mac Brazel carried them most of all. He had never asked for the story, yet it had found him. He had touched the fragments, felt their resistance, seen their strange glow in the sun. And he had been told, firmly, that it was a balloon. To speak otherwise was to invite attention he did not want. He complied, but the weight of contradiction never left him. The official photographs appeared again and again, officers posing beside neat piles of foil and sticks. They were meant to erase doubt, to present an answer that could be filed and forgotten. Yet to those who had seen the true fragments, the photographs looked staged, as though the truth had been swept from the frame and replaced with something easier to believe. So Roswell lived with two truths, the one printed in papers and the one whispered in memory. The official truth said balloon. The lived truth said something stranger. Between them stretched a silence the desert seemed to hold without effort. The military had secured its goal. The case was closed. The files were stamped. The story was sealed. Yet in sealing it, they had left behind a seam that would never close. Doubt had been planted, and doubt endures. At night, under the unbroken stars, the people of Roswell looked upward differently than before. The constellations still marked their paths across the heavens, steady and familiar. But behind them, or perhaps among them, there seemed to be something more, a presence unseen, unspoken, waiting. The desert was quiet again, yes, but the quiet was not the same. It was the quiet of withheld truths, of files locked behind heavy drawers, of memories pressed down but not erased. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and though the army had spoken its last word, Roswell's story had only just begun. The morning of July 8th began like any other in Roswell. Heat gathered early, pressing down on the streets. Shops opened their doors to let the first customers in. Radios hummed in kitchens with music and farm reports. Children hurried through chores before the sun grew too high. At the sheriff's office, though, the mood was different. On his desk lay fragments that had already drawn the attention of the army. Officers had examined them, had bent them, had carried them away in crates, yet still the matter was unsettled. A decision was made at Roswell Army Airfield that morning, and with it, a story would leave the desert and sweep across the country. The base issued a press release. Its words were plain, unadorned, typed in the crisp rhythm of Army language. But within them lay a phrase that would change history. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc. A disc, not a balloon, not meteorological debris. A disc, the statement spread quickly. Reporters already circling with whispers of strange debris on a ranch seized the words with astonishment. Newspapers raced to set the type, editors pushing the headline above the fold, bold and unmissable, Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The words leapt from presses in New Mexico, and by afternoon were carried by wire to Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. Telephones rang in newsrooms across the nation. Could it be true? Had the Army itself confirmed what so many had speculated, that objects in the sky, unexplained and mysterious, were not just imagination but reality? On Main Street in Roswell, people stood outside storefronts, newspapers in hand. They read the words aloud, voices rising with disbelief and excitement. Some laughed nervously, unsure what to make of it. Others spoke in hushed tones, glancing upward, as though expecting the sky itself to answer. Children whispered wide-eyed about visitors from the stars. For a brief moment, the extraordinary was official, not rumor, not speculation, but words signed and sent from the Army itself. The desert silence had been broken, and its echo reached far beyond the plains of New Mexico. In Washington, the announcement arrived like a ripple of static through the lines of communication. Offices stirred uneasily. Some officers frowned over the phrasing, puzzled at the boldness. A disc. Why use that word? Why not describe it as debris, as equipment, as anything less provocative? Some suspected the Roswell command had moved too quickly, speaking before orders from higher up could guide their words. But the release could not be unsent. The papers were already rolling, the radio already crackling. The phrase flying saucers swept across the nation in a matter of hours. Back in Roswell, the effect was immediate. At cafes, conversations circled the same questions. What had fallen? Where had it come from? Why had the army spoken so plainly? Neighbors looked at one another with cautious wonder. For those who had seen the debris, the statement confirmed what their hands already knew. It was no balloon. For those who had only heard whispers, the words ignited imagination. Reporters poured into town in greater numbers. They sought out the sheriff, the rancher, anyone who might have glimpsed the fragments before they vanished into army trucks. They knocked at doors, lingered outside fences, pressed questions into the air with restless urgency. Roswell, a small desert town, had become the center of the world's attention overnight. Brazil, caught at the center, felt the storm most keenly. His name appeared in print, his ranch described in detail, his discovery told and retold. Yet the more it spread, the less it resembled the quiet truth he had known. A morning ride, a glint in the grass, fragments gathered in puzzled hands. The army's words had transformed his simple discovery into something vast, something heavy, something that pressed down on him like the desert heat. The silence of the desert had been broken by a typewriter, by a phrase too clear to be ignored. But the silence would soon return, heavier than before. For now, though, on July 8th, the official word was flying disc. The sky was not empty. The army had said so. The press release left Roswell before the dust had even settled on the ranch roads. By telegraph and wire service, its words raced outward, carried faster than trains, faster than planes. In newsrooms across the country, editors leaned over desks, eyebrows raised as the words were read aloud. The intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group was fortunate enough to gain possession of a flying disc. The sentence struck like a bell. A disc captured by the army. Newspapers rushed to set the type. Linotype machines clattered, ink-stained fingers moved quickly, and the presses rolled with urgency. In Albuquerque, the Journal printed the headline, bold and unmissable. In Chicago, copy editors stripped away nuance and kept the words simple: Army has flying saucer. In New York, the story landed on editors' desks with the weight of astonishment. By evening, radios carried the tale across states, voices calm but edged with excitement. On porches in Kansas, farmers leaned forward to hear. In diners in Ohio, customers looked up from their plates as the announcer repeated the words. In California, where the sun had not yet set, families gathered around radios, children staring wide-eyed at their parents, as if waiting for answers that could not be given. The country listened, and the country wondered. In Roswell, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. The town, usually quiet, filled with strangers, reporters, photographers, curious visitors. Cars parked along Main Street, engines still ticking hot from long drives across the desert. Journalists leaned across counters in cafes, asking the same questions again and again. Where had the disc been found? What did it look like? Who had seen it? Each answer, no matter how hesitant, seemed to swell the story larger. The sheriff's office became a revolving door. George Wilcox spoke carefully, repeating only what he could. His words weighed against the army's official line. He described the rancher bringing fragments, the army taking control. He said little more. Reporters pressed, hungry for detail, but Wilcox's silence was steady. At Foster Ranch, Mac Brazel found no peace. Reporters arrived uninvited, their notebooks ready, their cameras clicking as he tried to tend his sheep. He grew weary of the questions, weary of repeating himself. He had found fragments, yes. They were strange, yes, but beyond that, what could he say? Still, his words appeared in print, reshaped and repeated until he scarcely recognized them. Meanwhile, across the nation, speculation ran wild. Some insisted the disc was proof of foreign powers testing new weapons. Others whispered that it was not from Earth at all. Editorials filled with speculation. The phrase flying saucer now spoken with both awe and unease. In Washington, officials read the morning papers with furrowed brows. To them, the release was a problem. It was too specific, too bold. Rumors of strange objects in the sky had been circulating for months, whispered in scattered reports, but they had always remained rumors. Now the army had spoken, and it had used the very words they had sought to avoid. Disc, saucer, captured. Telephones rang in the Pentagon. Questions came faster than answers. How had this happened? Who had authorized such a statement? Was there any truth behind it? Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pointing to the retraction already being prepared, but the damage had been done. The words had escaped. Back in Roswell, the atmosphere grew charged. Shopkeepers placed newspapers in windows where passers-by paused to stare. Children whispered about visitors from the stars. Families gathered on porches, gazing at the night sky with new eyes searching for movement among the steady stars. The desert air itself seemed to hold a different weight, as though the announcement had altered the silence. Even in the base, among the soldiers who had carried the fragments, the effect was felt. They heard the words repeated back on radios, saw the headlines shouted in print. They glanced at one another, but said nothing. They knew the fragments they had handled were not balloons. They knew the words of the press release had not been entirely false, yet their silence was trained, their duty clear. Whatever they had seen, whatever they suspected, they would keep to themselves. For a brief window of hours, America stood on the edge of wonder. The ordinary fabric of daily life had been pierced by a phrase too startling to ignore. Newspapers that usually carried stories of politics and crops and industry now shouted of discs in the desert. Radios that played music now carried words of saucers, and though the army would soon pull those words back, replacing them with the language of balloons and weather equipment, the first impression had already been made. The seed had been planted. On the night of July 8th, families looked upward as they had countless nights before. But this time, the sky was not just a canvas of stars. It was a question, a possibility. A silence that felt suddenly alive. The headlines glowed bold in windows. The words lingered in kitchens and parlors, and the desert, though quiet, seemed to pulse with the weight of what it had given. For the first time, the extraordinary was not whispered. It was printed, spoken, declared. The army had said it, and the world had heard. The morning of July 9th carried with it a different kind of silence. The excitement of the day before still lingered in the headlines, still glowed in the windows of newsstands, but inside the base, decisions had been made. The word disc was already being erased, replaced by something safer, smaller, and ordinary. At Roswell Army Airfield, officers prepared a second release. It spoke not of saucers or discs, but of balloons. Weather balloons, mundane, familiar, unthreatening. The fragments, it said, were pieces of meteorological equipment. The message was brisk and final. The mystery was gone. By the afternoon, photographs were arranged. In a small room, officers unfolded foil and sticks onto the floor, spreading them out neatly for the cameras. A general posed beside the fragments, pointing to them as though explaining their parts. The shutters clicked, the flash bulbs popped. The images would appear in newspapers within hours, carrying with them the new official truth. The effect was jarring. One day, the nation had been told of a captured disc. The next, it was told of a balloon. Readers blinked at the contradiction. Some laughed, shaking their heads at the army's clumsy misstep. Others frowned, uneasy at the sudden reversal, and a few whispered more darkly that the first story had been true and the second only a cover to pull it back into silence. In Roswell, confusion spread quickly. Shopkeepers who had read the bold flying saucer headline now showed customers the new edition, where foil and sticks were laid out like evidence of error. Waitresses poured coffee for men who argued quietly about what it meant. Was the first release a mistake, an over-eager officer rushing too soon to the press, or had the army revealed something it had not meant to, only to scramble for a safer explanation? At the ranch, Brazel felt the weight of the reversal more than anyone. Reporters pressed him with new questions. Had he truly seen a disc? Could the fragments have been balloon material all along? He repeated what he was told to say, his voice subdued, his eyes heavy. Yes, perhaps it was a balloon. Yes, perhaps he had been mistaken. But inside, the contradiction gnawed. He remembered the fragments bending and springing back, the beams that would not break, the strange symbols that faded in sunlight. Those were not balloons, yet the words he spoke now were balloon words. Neighbors noticed the change. He looked tired, drawn, older in a matter of days. He avoided long conversations. He turned his eyes down when asked about the field. For a man who had lived by plain truths, cattle counted, fences mended, the forced silence pressed hardest of all. The army's line hardened quickly. The balloon story spread across newspapers nationwide, replacing the saucer headlines. Editors who had set type in a rush the day before now printed the correction with equal certainty. Readers shook their heads, uncertain whether to laugh at the blunder or question the haste. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Among the soldiers who had touched the fragments, silence held. They repeated the official story when asked, their words trimmed to match the photographs. Yet in their memories, the field remained as it had been, glittering with fragments too strong, too strange, too unyielding to be explained away so neatly. Their duty was silence, and they kept it. But silence is not forgetting. In Washington, officials exhaled in relief. The story had been pulled back from the edge. The headlines would fade, the balloon explanation would stand, and the matter could be closed. Files were stamped, secret, and tucked into drawers. The flying disc was erased with ink, but never with memory. For the people of Roswell, the retraction left only questions. Which version was true? Why had the army spoken one way then another? Why had they shown fragments so ordinary when ranchers had described material so strange? The contradictions hung in the air like dust after a storm, settling slowly, refusing to vanish. The desert returned to its wide silence, but the silence carried weight. Those who had seen the fragments knew more than they could say. Those who had read the first headline remembered it more sharply than the second. And those who listened to the stillness of the night sky heard in it not reassurance, but wonder. The balloon story became the official line, but it never erased the first announcement. The two truths sat side by side, the one printed in bold and the one whispered in memory. And in that gap, the legend of Roswell began to take root. The desert was quiet again, but the quiet had changed. By July 10th, the headlines had shifted. Where once they had shouted of discs and saucers, they now carried photographs of foil and sticks, rubber and twine. The balloon story was the new official truth, pressed into ink, folded into pages, stacked on porches across America. For many, it was easier this way. Balloons fit neatly into the order of things, saucers did not. At Roswell Army Airfield, the atmosphere settled into careful quiet. Officers moved with more restraint, their words measured, their desks cleared of anything that might invite questions. The fragments themselves were gone from the base, shipped under guard, carried into the stream of military logistics, where crates vanished into the folds of distance and classification. For those still at Roswell, there was nothing left to see, nothing left to say. The case was closed, but memory is not so easily closed. In Roswell, people carried the contradiction with them. They remembered the first release, the one typed so clearly, the one that said flying disc. They remembered the rush of reporters, the excitement on Main Street, the sudden wonder in the air. And they remembered how swiftly it was all replaced by balloons. The shift was too sharp, too complete. It left behind not certainty, but doubt. Brazel bore it most of all. In the weeks after, he grew weary of the questions, weary of the glances from neighbors, weary of the quiet presence of soldiers who seemed always nearby. He tried to resume his life, sheep to tend, fences to mend, chores that waited for no man, but the weight of contradiction followed him like a second shadow. He had seen what he had seen. He had touched what he had touched, yet the words in the papers told him otherwise. The townspeople learned, as small towns do, to let silence do its work. They spoke less openly, shifting the topic when strangers lingered too long. But in the quiet moments, at kitchen tables, at the edge of fields, in hushed voices on porches, the memory remained. They remembered the first headline more clearly than the second. They carried it like a pebble in the shoe, small, persistent, never forgotten. Across the country, the balloon story found its mark. It was printed, repeated, folded into the ordinary. The wider public, unacquainted with the details, accepted it with a shrug. A balloon was easier to believe than a disc, and so the story slipped back into the background, overshadowed by other news, politics, weather, the stirrings of the Cold War. Yet in the shadows of Washington offices, the files thickened, reports were logged, fragments described, signatures added. Each page bore the familiar stamp, secret. The case was closed to the public, but it remained alive in drawers and cabinets, where memory was preserved, not in whispers but in ink. Those who signed the papers knew what had been said first, they knew what had been taken back. And they too carried the weight of contradiction. The military's announcement had begun with certainty, then ended with silence. It had opened the door to wonder, then slammed it shut. But in slamming it, it had drawn more eyes, more ears, more questions. In Roswell, the desert kept its quiet rhythm. Sheep grazed, windmills turned, trains passed through, but those who had been there, who had seen the field or touched the fragments, could not look at the land the same way again. They knew what the papers said, they knew what the army insisted, yet they also knew what their own eyes had seen. And between those two truths stretched the long shadow of doubt. That doubt would not vanish. It would pass from one telling to another, from one decade to the next, whispered in bars, spoken in documentaries, printed in books. Long after the balloon story had hardened into official history, the memory of the first headline, the bold words that said flying disc, remained bright in the mind. The desert is patient, it does not rush, it holds what is given to it, and waits. In 1947, it had held fragments that glimmered strangely in the sun. Those fragments were gone now, carried away, hidden from sight. But the memory of them lingered, woven into the silence of the land, whispered by the wind that brushed across wire fences and dry grass. For the army, the case was closed. For Roswell, it was not. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. And the first announcement, though withdrawn, would echo for generations. The years softened the edges of the story, but the voices remained. They did not crash into history. They arrived gently, like footfalls on a wooden floor after midnight. Some were recorded on brittle tape. Some were written in tidy cursive on lined paper. Others were passed across kitchen tables and living room couches, spoken so low the words barely rose above the hum of the icebox. Each voice held a piece of the night. None claimed to hold it all. The first voice was a woman who lived on the edge of town, where yards slipped into pasture and the telephone wires sang when the wind rose. She remembered July as a dry weight on the skin. Her husband had fallen asleep with the radio on, the dial turned low, the glow from the set painting a small steady square on the wall. She lay awake, listening to the fan and the far-off bark of dogs, when a light moved across the ceiling, as if someone had passed a lantern outside. Only there was no one outside. She rose, careful not to wake him, and stood at the window with her hands on the sill. The screen was cool. The world was crisp in its outlines, water tower, cottonwoods, the faint silver of the road where moonlight touched it. The light passed again, slower than a falling star, nearer than a plane. She could not hear it, not the way one hears a motor or the beat of wings. But she felt something like pressure behind the ears, a thin hum inside her skull. It did not hurt, it only insisted. Then it was gone, slipping behind the shape of houses toward the dark fields beyond. She did not wake him. In the morning she said only that it must have been heat lightning, though there had been no storm. Years later, when her grandson asked what she remembered of Roswell, she spoke of the light without using the word strange. She spoke as if describing a summer breeze. But the way her fingers rested against the mug told of a steadier truth. The night had leaned close and whispered, and she had listened. Another voice belonged to a boy, 13 that summer, who lay on his back atop the roof of the shed to catch what coolness he could. He had learned the names of the constellations the way other boys learned the names of baseball players: Orion, Scorpius, Cygnus with its swan's long neck. He liked how the Milky Way looked like something spilled and never cleaned. He watched the sky for falling stars, wishing on each one even though he knew wishing was a kind of play. When the light came, it did not behave like falling. It slowed. He swore it slowed. It paused, not stopped, not fixed, but held, as if measuring the space between one breath and the next. Then it went on, angling downward, no tail, no borrowed fire from the atmosphere, only itself. He scrambled down from the roof, slipped in the loose dirt, and nearly tore his shirt on a nail. He ran to where the yard ended, and the field began, then stopped because he did not know what he would do if the thing turned and came back. He stood with his fists at his sides and felt his heart pound, not with fear exactly, but with the drumbeat of a boundary being crossed. In the morning he told his mother he had dreamed of a slow star. She kissed his forehead and said maybe he had. There was the lineman too, the man who walked the poles and listened with his hands. He could tell the weather from the way the wire sang. On still nights it held a low, patient tone, like a cello bow drawn softly. On windy days the pitch rose until it skated along nerves. Once, after a dust storm, the wires crackled with grit, and he had to climb and brush them clean where they crossed. On that July night, walking a stretch west of town, he stopped because the song in the wire went out of tune. It thickened, as if pressed by a thumb, then loosened again in a low oscillation that did not match wind or load. He looked up and saw nothing. He listened and heard, not silence, but a new note laid under the old ones, a faint, steady vibration that moved overhead and toward the ranch country. He marked the time in his pocket notebook and kept walking, and only later, when the papers spoke of discs and then balloons, did he circle that entry in pencil. The voices were not all from that night. Some spoke of mornings after, of fields that glinted, of sheep that refused to enter a certain gate, of a smell they could not place, not oil, not ozone, something cleaner, sharper, gone as soon as it was noted. A ranch hand remembered his boot slipping on a strip of metal, the thickness of an orange peel. He had cursed, bent to pick it up, and found it folded under his thumb, and then unfolded without a crease. He had laughed because it seemed like a magic trick, then stopped because it did not feel like a trick at all. He ran it along the edge of a fence post, as if expecting splinters to catch, but it slid smooth. He tucked it in his pocket, thinking to show it to a friend, and later, after the army trucks had come and the field lay bare, he found his pocket empty, though he did not remember removing it. He was not a man given to forgetting. It made him quiet in ways no one could see. A clerk at the base remembered the forms, how ordinary they looked compared to the talk they carried. She filed reports every day, maintenance, requisitions, schedules. That week, she filed papers that bore a different density, the way a sealed envelope feels heavier than the weight of paper should allow. She did not read beyond her clearance. She did not ask beyond her station. But as she slid the folders into the cabinet and turned the key, she felt the way one feels when a conversation stops as you enter a room. The shape of words, not the words themselves. A decade later, after she had left the base, married, and moved 3 states away, she would wake sometimes with the memory of metal that did not bend, though she had never seen it. Only the men who had. A few voices belonged to men whose job it was to say little. A driver who had taken crates from a storeroom to the flight line one night remembered the canvas covers and the way the straps had been tightened until the wood complained. He remembered the smell, not oil, not dust, not the clean tang of new crates, something like the inside of a tin when it has held water too long. He drove with his window down and his mouth gone dry. He signed a sheet, turned his truck, and drove away into the unremarkable portion of his shift. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell himself, not out loud. There were voices that contradicted themselves in the telling, not because they were untrue, but because memory is not a ledger. A woman said she heard a low hum as steady as a held note. Later, she said perhaps it was a truck on a far road. A farmer said he saw a glow behind the ridge. Later he decided it might have been someone burning trash. A man in a bar swore he had seen soldiers carry a shape under a tarpaulin. Years later, he admitted he had been several drinks in, and that the shape could have been anything at all. Each voice offered its peace and its doubt. The doubt did not erase the peace, it made it human. What tied them together was the tone, the same quiet cadence that shows when people speak of something that has not finished with them. They did not try to convince. They did not reach for certainty or for spectacle. They spoke as one speaks of weather, of births, of small griefs with care. Even when they used the word disc, they said it as if placing it gently on a table where no one would knock it to the floor. Years later, when investigators opened the old cabinets and asked for recollections, the voices returned in that same soft way. The man who had been the boy on the shed roof said he had learned the names of more constellations, and that none of them contained what he had seen. The lineman said wires still sang, and that the new lines with their better insulation sang differently, but sang nonetheless. The clerk said she had kept the habit of turning keys with a sense of witness. The ranch hand said he still patted his pockets sometimes, as if the fragment might have tucked itself back where it had never been allowed to remain. None of these voices proved anything in the way proofs are demanded. They were not equations or photographs that could not be staged. They were the record of a town that had listened to its night and found the night listened back. The desert held them all. It does this with stories the way it does with bones, covers them, keeps them, does not hurry them toward daylight. When the wind came up, the telephone wires sang their old notes again. When the stars wheeled, they did so without opinion. And when the voices paused, the silence did not close like a door. It remained ajar, as if waiting for one more sentence. The sky was not empty. The voices were gentle, and in their gentleness, the story widened. The town of Roswell lived in two layers, the surface of quiet shops and ranches, and the undercurrent of whispers that passed between neighbors when the sun slipped low. Everyone had heard something, though few admitted it openly. Some voices rose in the safety of family tables. Others stayed locked behind lips pressed thin with caution. One of the clearest voices belonged to a teacher who lived just off Main Street. She remembered that July for its heat and the way the cicadas filled the air with their steady drone. She had walked to the grocer on the morning. The headlines screamed of a flying disc. She bought bread, a sack of flour, and a handful of sweets for her students, though school was weeks away. At the counter, the clerk showed her the paper with a grin that was part disbelief, part thrill. She read the headline once, then again, the words bright and strange against the ordinary gray ink. She folded the paper carefully into her bag and carried it home as if it were something fragile. That evening, she watched the horizon from her porch. A glow hovered faintly, far off, not like lightning, not like lanterns on a ranch road. She said nothing to anyone, not even to her husband. But when she later told her grandchildren of that summer, she always began with the newspaper headline and ended with the light that moved where no light should have been. She never used the word ship. She only said, "It wasn't a star." Another testimony came from a deputy who rode with the sheriff when the army took control of the ranch. He remembered the heat of the steering wheel under his palm, the dust curling behind their tires, and the strange quiet of the men in uniform who said little and looked much. He saw pieces of metal stacked in crates, ordinary yet not ordinary, dull in color but oddly weightless when lifted. He had carried one fragment himself, a strip the size of his palm, and when he bent it, it folded, then smoothed back without a mark. He told his wife that night, whispered in the dark, as if the walls might listen. Years later, when asked, he said only, "I held something I've never held before, and I'll never hold again." The voices extended beyond the town. A nurse at the base hospital, years after, spoke softly of a night when extra staff were called in. She said she had glimpsed stretchers wheeled through halls, covered tightly in sheets. She did not see what lay beneath. She remembered only the hush of footsteps and the way officers told her firmly, "You didn't see this." She nodded, said nothing, but the memory lingered like the echo of a door closing. When pressed years later, she would shake her head. "I didn't see them. I only saw the way people looked. And that was enough." Some voices contradicted each other. A ranch hand said the debris was scattered wide, sharp and shining. Another swore it was small, compact, gathered quickly by soldiers. A housewife remembered soldiers knocking on doors, asking if anyone had found strange metal. A grocer claimed no such men ever came. The stories diverged, yet the tone was the same. Something unusual had passed through their lives, and the army had moved to gather it like spilled grain. There were also voices that carried unease about silence itself. A young man working at the radio station said he had received a call to hold back certain reports, to let the army's announcement speak for all. He had felt the weight of secrecy pressed down from above. Years later, he confessed that it was the first time he realized information could be shaped, not by what was said, but by what was kept unsaid. Some of the most compelling voices were those who spoke not of objects or debris, but of feeling. A woman who lived near the ranch said her sheep refused to graze in one corner of the field for weeks. They balked, pulled at their tethers, bleated in agitation. She could not say why, only that animals sense what people cannot. Another man said the nights felt different afterward, as though the sky itself had gained a presence, as though one could feel eyes in the dark where before there had been only stars. Even decades later, the voices carried the same cadence, calm, steady, reluctant. None sought attention. They spoke not as storytellers but as witnesses who carried a burden they did not ask for. Their memories varied in detail, but not in weight. Each one bore the imprint of something extraordinary pressed against the ordinary fabric of life. And through all the contradictions, one truth rang clear. No one who had seen, heard, or touched the fragments of that summer ever forgot. Whether they believed in balloons, in discs, or in nothing at all, they remembered. The memory stayed, like a pebble lodged in the shoe, shaping each step taken afterward. The desert does not argue. It simply holds what it is given. In 1947, it was given voices, quiet, persistent, unforgettable voices, and they remain, scattered like the fragments themselves, each one reflecting a sliver of a night that never truly ended. The silence lingered, the sky was not empty, and the voices of Roswell kept whispering into the decades that followed. The voices of Roswell did not remain only in kitchens and fields. They found their way into notebooks, into files, into the quiet archives of those tasked with collecting them. Some were recorded officially, in the dry cadence of military reports. Others were scribbled quickly by reporters who pressed pencils hard against paper as if speed might trap the truth before it could slip away. And years later, researchers would sit across from the same men and women, tape recorders, whirring, listening as memories returned in careful tones. In the first days, the army moved swiftly. Soldiers not only gathered debris from the ranch, but also words from the people who had seen it. A deputy was asked to describe the fragments. His testimony, stripped of hesitation, was typed neatly into a report. Metallic in appearance, lightweight, resistant to bending, The words looked ordinary on paper, yet when read aloud, they carried the awe of a man who had felt something unordinary in his hands. Other statements were even shorter. Nothing unusual, no comment. Weather equipment. Some of these were genuine dismissals. Others, it seemed, were the result of voices that had already been guided by the weight of military presence. Silence can be taught quickly, and many in Roswell learned it that week. Reporters, too, gathered accounts, though their papers often reshaped them for headlines. A ranch hand's quiet observation became a bold claim. A teacher's soft words about a light in the sky were printed as witnesses confirmed saucer sighting. The voices of ordinary people, in the hands of the press, grew louder than they had intended. Some residents recoiled from this, refusing further questions. Others chose silence rather than see their words twisted again. Years later, when researchers returned to Roswell with tape recorders and long lists of questions, the voices were older, steadier, sometimes unsure. Memories had blurred, details had shifted, but the core remained. A man who had been a boy, then still remembered the slow light in the sky. A woman still recalled the way animals had refused to graze near the debris field. A base clerk still spoke of files heavier than the paper they contained. Investigators compiled these voices, weaving them into books and reports. They arranged them in chapters and appendices, drawing lines between them, seeking patterns. To some, the testimonies formed a clear picture. Something extraordinary had fallen, and secrecy had buried it. To others, the contradictions proved only that memory was fragile, that stories grow in the telling. Yet even skeptics admitted the persistence of the voices was remarkable. Decades had passed, yet the people of Roswell spoke as if the summer of 1947 had never truly ended. The memory of fragments that bent and returned, of symbols that faded in sunlight, of headlines shouted and then withdrawn, these did not fade. They lingered, stubborn and insistent. Some testimonies were gathered with reluctance. A retired nurse, approached in her quiet home years later, agreed to speak only when promised anonymity. She said she had seen stretchers wheeled through the base hospital, sheets pulled tight, officers standing guard. She admitted she could not swear what lay beneath. But she remembered the silence, the gravity of the moment, the way her hands shook as she signed a form promising discretion. Another voice came from a man who had driven one of the army trucks. He said he had lifted crates that felt lighter than they should have been, as if filled with nothing but air. He had driven them to the base, parked as instructed, and signed his name on a ledger. For years he said nothing, but in old age he admitted he had never shaken the memory of lifting a box that seemed too empty, too insistent in its refusal to be ordinary. In Washington, investigators who handled the files heard these voices only as reports. The texture of hesitation, the tone of awe, the undercurrent of unease, all were flattened into lines of type. They read metallic debris and unidentified material, without the quiver in the deputy's voice, without the long pause of the ranch hand, without the nervous laughter of the boy who saw a slow star. Something was always lost in translation, but the desert remembered, and those who lived there carried the voices forward, even when they softened, even when they doubted their own details. A teacher's grandson grew up with the story of a light that was not a star. A lineman's son heard about the wires that sang a strange new note. Each generation received the memory, not as proof, but as inheritance. For every file stamped a secret, there was a whisper that defied the stamp. For every headline corrected, there was a memory that refused correction. The army could collect fragments, but it could not gather every voice. Some always slipped through, quiet but insistent, finding their way into the world again. In the end, the witness accounts were not one story but many. Some contradicted each other, some overlapped, some diverged, but together they formed a chorus, not loud, not unified, but steady. a chorus that carried across decades, reminding anyone who listened that in 1947 the desert had given something unusual, and the people who touched it had never forgotten. The silence lingered, the sky was not empty, and the voices of Roswell, scattered and persistent, continued to whisper their fragments of truth. The voices of Roswell did not arrive all at once, nor did they fade when told to. They came like the desert wind, sometimes strong enough to rattle doors, sometimes faint enough to be mistaken for silence, but always present. Each voice carried a sliver of the night in 1947, and together those slivers began to form a shape too persistent to ignore. One of the most enduring voices belonged to a ranch hand who had been with Mac Brazel when soldiers first swept the field. He told, many years later, of walking beside the army men as they filled their sacks and crates. He remembered the way one soldier paused, holding a strip of metal in his hands, bending it again and again, whispering a word under his breath that the ranch hand could not quite hear. The soldier slipped the piece into his pocket, only to remove it moments later when an officer barked an order. The fragment went into the crate, the soldier's shoulders stiff as if he had been caught reaching for fire. That image stayed with the ranch hand all his life, a man in uniform, trained to obey, betraying awe in the small curve of his spine. Another account came from a child, no more than 8, who had lived in Roswell that summer. He said he remembered soldiers knocking on the door, speaking to his father in low tones. His father answered briefly, closed the door, and told the family not to mention what they had seen. The boy had caught only glimpses, trucks moving in the distance, men carrying covered shapes, but the weight of the silence pressed on him more heavily than the sight itself. When he grew older, he told the story not with certainty, but with the ache of memory. It was the first time I learned adults could see something, and then pretend they hadn't. There was also the voice of a nurse who swore she had been called unexpectedly to the base hospital. She described stretchers brought in at odd hours, sheets drawn tightly over them, and the way officers avoided her gaze as they passed. She never claimed to have seen what lay beneath, but she remembered the hush, the gravity, the way even the sound of shoes on tile seemed subdued. Her words were hesitant, often broken by long pauses, but the unease in her tone told as much as her description. In later decades, when researchers began gathering these stories, they found contradictions. Some said the debris covered acres, others swore it was confined to a small patch of land. Some remembered symbols etched faintly on the fragments, others said the surfaces were blank. But even in contradiction, the testimonies carried the same resonance. What was found was not ordinary. The Army's balloon story may have closed the case in newspapers, but it did not close it in the minds of witnesses. Each account, however small, became a counterweight to the official explanation. A deputy who bent the strange foil and watched it return to shape. A lineman who heard the wires sing a new note. A clerk who filed papers heavier than the words they contained. A boy who saw a slow star pause above the desert. No single voice proved the story, but together they formed a foundation, fragile yet stubborn, on which the legend of Roswell was built. By the 1960s and 70s, when new investigators arrived with tape recorders and notebooks, the voices were older but still steady. Men who had been young soldiers spoke cautiously of crates and convoys. Women who had been nurses and clerks spoke of nights when silence grew heavy in hospital halls and offices. Ranchers spoke of sheep that would not cross a certain field. The stories varied in detail, but the tone was the same, calm, reluctant, honest. They were not shouted, they were not dressed in spectacle. They were spoken like truths too quiet to be denied. For each official file stamped a secret, there were a dozen voices that defied the stamp. For each photograph of foil and sticks, there were memories of fragments that bent and refused to break. For every retraction, there was a recollection of the first bold headline, "Army captures flying disc." These voices became the threads that bound the Roswell mystery together across decades. Without them, the story might have been forgotten, folded neatly into history as a balloon, and nothing more. With them, it persisted, not as proof, but as presence. The desert carried the weight too. The field where the fragments had lain looked no different in later years. Grass grew, fences sagged, sheep grazed again. But for those who knew, the land itself seemed to hum with memory. They spoke of it not as a scar, but as a place where silence had once been broken and could never return to what it was. The legend of Roswell was not built by headlines alone, nor by files, nor by secrecy. It was built by people, ordinary men and women who lived through an extraordinary moment, who carried the memory in their voices and passed it on when asked. The Army's announcement and retraction had lasted 2 days. The voices lasted lifetimes, and they still echo. The desert was not empty. The silence was not ordinary, and the voices of Roswell, gathered and retold, became the heartbeat of a mystery that endures. The desert wind quieted, but behind closed doors the air was far from still. At Roswell Army Airfield, after the last crates had been loaded and the last reporters turned away, the men in uniform gathered in rooms that smelled faintly of dust and oil. The business of debriefing had begun. The officers who had led the recovery sat at long tables, their notebooks open, their pencils poised. Soldiers who had knelt in the debris field were brought in one by one. Each was asked to recount what he had seen, what he had touched, what he had carried. The questions were calm, deliberate, the tone steady, but beneath the orderliness lay an urgency that could not be disguised. One private described lifting a beam no heavier than wood, but impossible to break. Another spoke of foil that crumpled, but returned to its shape. A sergeant recalled faint markings, lines and shapes that looked almost like letters but not in any language he knew. Each man told his story in simple words, yet their voices carried hesitation, as though the strangeness of the fragments still clung to them. The officers listened, wrote, and nodded. Then in quiet tones they reminded each soldier of his duty. The material was classified. The story was closed. What they had seen was not to be discussed outside those walls. Silence was not a request. It was an order. At higher levels, the debriefings grew more complex. Intelligence officers compared notes, debated phrasing, weighed the risks of disclosure. Some argued the first press release had been a mistake, an over-eager announcement that had slipped past proper channels. Others believed it had been an intentional probe, a test to measure public reaction. Whatever the origin, all agreed that the words, "flying disc," had opened a door they could not allow to remain ajar. Reports were drafted. The language was cautious, stripped of color, reduced to technical description. Where soldiers had spoken of strange resilience, the reports used terms like lightweight alloy. Where markings had been described, the reports spoke only of surface impressions. The awe and unease were flattened into bureaucratic calm. On paper, the fragments looked less extraordinary, more manageable, easier to fold into the explanation already chosen. Balloon, in Washington, cables arrived with summaries. Files thickened with pages that spoke in dry cadences, their words drained of wonder. Yet the very act of stamping them secret gave away the truth. If the matter were ordinary, it would not need such weight of silence. Meanwhile, in Roswell, the civilians who had seen the fragments were also quietly approached. Some were asked to recount their observations. Their words, too, were written down, though few ever saw those notes again. Others were reminded more firmly to keep their memories private, for the good of security, for the good of the country. The message was always polite, but the meaning was unmistakable. The debriefings were not only about facts, they were about shaping memory. Each time a witness was asked to describe what he had seen, and then told how it should be understood, the line between observation and explanation blurred. Over time, the balloon story pressed down heavier, encouraged in repetition until it became easier to speak than silence itself. Yet not all memories bent so easily. In later years, when the files were pried open and the witnesses were older, many still described the same details they had shared in 1947. The foil that sprang back, the beams that resisted force, the sheep that refused the field. The strange quiet of soldiers working under orders they did not explain. Despite decades of silence, the echoes of those first debriefings remained. Back in the base offices, the atmosphere grew denser. Officers sat late into the night, drafting reports, crossing out words, choosing phrases carefully. They knew their words would travel upward, to desks in Washington, to the attention of men who decided what the nation could or could not be told. Each adjective mattered, each noun carried weight. A slip could spark more headlines, more questions, so the language became thin, precise, unremarkable. Debris, weather device, rubber, foil, sticks. The extraordinary dissolved into the ordinary, or so the papers said. But in the minds of those who had seen the field, no words could erase the memory. The debriefings could shape silence, they could not erase awe. The desert remembered, the soldiers remembered, and the files, locked away, carried both truths, the official story and the quiet testimony beneath it. In Washington, the desert was far away, but the echo of Roswell arrived quickly, carried by cables that hummed across the continent. Messages left New Mexico in the clipped rhythm of military code, their words stripped of awe but heavy with urgency. By the time they reached the Pentagon, the phrases were already polished, their edges blunted. Unidentified debris, recovered materials, possible meteorological device. The officers who read those first summaries sat in rooms that smelled of ink and leather, the air heavy with July heat, despite the fans spinning overhead. Their desks were stacked with reports of troop movements, foreign tests, and the quiet chess game already beginning with the Soviet Union. Yet, amid all of this, the word disk flickered like a spark in the margins of their papers. It was not a word to be ignored. Meetings followed swiftly. Men in uniform and men in suits gathered around long oak tables. The Roswell report was read aloud, each phrase weighed, each detail considered. The description of foil that folded and returned. The account of beams light yet unbreakable. The mention, quiet, almost lost, of symbols faint on the surface. The room remained silent for a long moment after the reading ended. Then the debate began. Some argued it was nothing more than experimental equipment, perhaps one of their own projects straying from its path. Others suggested it might be foreign, a test balloon or device from across the ocean, though no one could explain how or why it would appear in the skies of New Mexico. A few, speaking more cautiously, admitted the fragments did not fit neatly into any known category. But such admissions found no home in the minutes of the meeting. The decision, when it came, was not announced with fanfare. It was recorded in the slow, deliberate hand of a secretary. The matter was to be classified, the explanation simplified, the story closed. A weather balloon, nothing more, nothing less. From that point, the machinery of secrecy moved with efficiency. Additional reports were drafted, stamped secret, and filed into cabinets, where clerks slid drawers shut with finality. Orders were relayed back to Roswell, maintain the balloon explanation. Ensure all witnesses comply. Any further inquiries were to be directed to higher offices. The language of the debriefings shifted accordingly. Where soldiers had spoken of wonder, the reports now spoke of error. Where witnesses had described strangeness, the files described confusion. Each retelling stripped the event of its edges until the memory fit into the narrow frame of balloon. The extraordinary became bureaucratic, but inside the walls of those meetings, not everyone was satisfied. A colonel who had reviewed the photographs frowned over the thin foil laid neatly on the floor. He had seen the field notes from men who described material that defied their strength. He tapped his pen against the desk and asked quietly if the fragments in the photographs were the same as those described in the reports. No one answered directly. The minutes did not record the question. In intelligence offices, analysts compiled the reports alongside other files of unexplained sightings. Roswell was entered as one case among many, though its proximity to a nuclear-capable unit gave it special weight. The analysts did not speculate in writing, but in the margins of conversations, some admitted the incident felt different, heavier, more difficult to dismiss. Still, the balloon story was repeated until it became policy. Press conferences reinforced it. Photographs supported it. Each time the phrase was spoken, it hardened further, like a stone laid in a wall. The public line was set. Roswell had been a mistake, nothing more. Back in New Mexico, the effect of these higher debriefings was felt in quiet ways. Soldiers who had spoken too freely found themselves reassigned. Civilians who had shared too much found polite reminders delivered to their doors. Reporters who pressed too hard discovered that their questions were met with silence. The instructions had traveled downward from Washington, and silence moved outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Yet in the quiet of the desert night, doubt persisted. The men who had touched the fragments remembered what their hands had felt. The rancher remembered the way the sheep had refused the field. The townspeople remembered the headlines that had shouted "flying disc" before being hushed into balloons. The official story pressed hard, but memory pressed harder still. In Washington, the files grew thicker. Copies were sent to other agencies, some with entire paragraphs blacked out. Notes were tucked into folders, initials signed quickly in margins. The Roswell incident became part of a larger pattern. Incidents noted, explained away, but never forgotten entirely. Each one filed under secrecy, each one preserved even as it was denied. The debriefings had done their work. The voices of soldiers, clerks, and ranchers had been heard, reshaped, and stored. Officially, the matter was closed, but beneath the stamps and signatures, the truth remained stubborn. It lived in memory, in whispers, in the silence of the desert that had once been broken. The desert remembered. The sky was not empty, and the debriefings, though meant to bury the story, only deepened its roots. The debriefings were not only about facts, they were about people. Each man, each woman who had touched the fragments, who had glimpsed the soldiers, who had spoken of the light in the sky, all were drawn, willingly or not, into the quiet machinery of control. At Roswell Army Airfield, young soldiers sat across from senior officers, notebooks open between them. They described what they had seen in the debris field, how the strange metal bent and straightened, how beams resisted pressure. The officers listened, nodded, and wrote. Then, with the same steady voices, they told the soldiers how to remember it. Not extraordinary, not unknown. Weather equipment, balloon. The soldiers saluted, swallowed their unease, and carried the new memory forward like an issued weapon. For many the lesson was simple. Loyalty meant silence. The army did not reward speculation, it rewarded obedience. So the young men returned to their barracks, to their drills, to their flights, speaking less than they had before. In time, their memories folded under duty, though the impressions never truly vanished. In quiet moments, in later years, they would recall the fragments not as balloons, but as something stranger, heavier in its very lightness. Civilians, too, felt the press of debriefing. A deputy sheriff recalled being summoned to the base, asked to repeat his story under the watch of uniformed men. He told them what he had seen. Fragments on a table, smooth and unyielding, and watched as their pencils moved. Then one officer leaned forward and said softly, "For the record, you saw balloon material." The deputy hesitated. The officer repeated it, slower, his eyes steady. The deputy nodded, not because it was true, but because it was easier. Years later, he said the moment felt like signing a paper he had not read. Mac Brazel bore the heaviest weight. The rancher had been brought into town again, this time to sit across from officers who questioned him for hours. They asked about the field, about the fragments, about the neighbors he had spoken to. Each answer was written down, then rephrased by the officers until it aligned with the balloon story. When he faltered, they reminded him of duty, of security, of the risks of loose words in a dangerous world. He was not a man who sought conflict. He agreed, quietly, though the agreement pressed hard against his chest. Afterward, he withdrew from neighbors, from reporters, from the story itself. Silence became his fence line, and he did not cross it again. For townsfolk, the debriefings came in gentler but no less firm ways. A knock at the door, a soldier smiling politely, asking a few questions, reminding them to keep quiet, a letter delivered, thanking them for their cooperation. In some cases, a visit to an employer, a word dropped that it would be best if curiosity ended. The people of Roswell learned quickly that silence was safer. Conversations grew shorter, voices dropped lower. The story lived on, but beneath the surface, like water flowing underground. Reporters, too, felt the weight. Some were called into briefings where officers laid out the balloon explanation in neat rehearsed sentences. They were told the case was closed, that further speculation would only harm public trust. Some reporters accepted this readily. Others resisted, but their editors received calls, their papers leaned on, and soon even the most skeptical voices softened. Headlines that had shouted, "Flying disc," now repeated, "Weather balloon," with equal boldness, as if the ink itself had chosen a side. The debriefings did not erase memory, they reshaped it. They did not silence voices completely. They taught them caution. Over time, this caution became habit. People remembered, but they remembered quietly. The memories slipped into the cadence of whispers, into the pauses between sentences, into the things not said at all. Decades later, when investigators returned to ask questions, they found the shape of those old debriefings still present. Witnesses paused before answering, looked around rooms, as if listening for unseen ears. Some spoke freely, at last, but others still hesitated, conditioned by years of silence. The shadow of the debriefings lingered longer than the words themselves. In Washington, the reports moved upward, through layers of bureaucracy. Each debriefing note became another page in a file, another line in an index. To the clerks and officers who handled them, the words looked ordinary, but to those who had spoken them, they were pieces of memory flattened into ink. The gap between lived truth and recorded truth widened with every line. Yet the desert remembered differently. Its silence could not be reshaped. The field where the fragments had lain bore no scar, but those who had stood there never forgot the shimmer of the morning light on unearthly metal. The land itself seemed to hum with it, though only those who knew could hear. The debriefings had done their work. They had secured silence, shaped stories, written reports, but in doing so, they had also left something behind, a residue of unease, a quiet resistance that grew stronger with time. The people of Roswell had been taught to speak in certain words, but beneath those words, their memories lingered, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and the debriefings, meant to close the story, had instead carried it forward into legend. Paper has a way of pretending to be the end of things. A signature lands, a stamp falls, a file slides into a drawer, and the sound it makes, soft, final, suggests that a matter has been settled. In the weeks after Roswell, the debriefings dissolved into exactly that ritual: typed pages, initials in the margin, carbon copies stacked and clipped, folders labeled with tidy numbers that seemed to promise closure. At the base, clerks learned the rhythms by heart. Reports arrived, were sorted, were logged, were sent up the chain. A sergeant carried a box to records, signed for it, and watched it disappear into rows of metal cabinets that smelled faintly of ink and cold dust. The doors closed with a dull click. Lights buzzed overhead. Outside, the desert burned white under noon. If anyone paused to consider what the files meant beyond their pages, the room kept its secret. In Washington, the ritual grew larger. Offices filled with the hum of fans and the scrape of chair legs on polished floors. Memos crossed desks, each one smoother than the last, each version thinner in tone. Where the first notes from Roswell had carried the voltage of surprise, the later ones moved like water over stone, worn to the shape of policy. Weather balloon was repeated until it felt less like explanation than punctuation. It ended every sentence. It ended every question. The men who drafted those sentences knew the weight of their words. Some had seen wars closed by documents. They believed in the magic of paper. Others, quietly, privately, understood that paper only covers what remains alive beneath it. But they wrote anyway, because that is what the mouth of a large machine requires, language precise enough to hold for now, flexible enough to bend later, deniable enough to survive daylight. Back in Roswell, the consequences of those sentences arrived by echo. Debriefings became retellings, retellings became habits. Civilians learned the safe version and kept it ready like a coin for toll. Soldiers folded their original impressions under layers of duty. Mac Brazel walked his fence lines with a new reluctance for talk, as if words themselves might lift dust he could not afford to breathe. In town, people still gathered and still asked, but they asked in the way one asks about weather already past, carefully, with an eye on the horizon. Over time, the debriefings sank like stones into a reservoir no one was meant to visit. The surface looked calm again. On Sundays, church bells rang. On Fridays, paydays came. The base lifted and landed its planes, and the desert rehearsed its eternal script of heat and cold, light and dark. The world insisted on continuity. The files cooperated, but the body remembers what the file forgets. A deputy's hands decades later still recalled the exact resistance of a strip of metal that would not keep a crease. A lineman could still hear the day the wires sang a note that belonged to no weather. A clerk could still feel the weight of folders that seemed heavier than paper. These were scars that did not show under sleeves, the kind that ache mainly in certain seasons and certain silence. The debriefings left their marks in other ways too. A young officer, who had stood in a room while witnesses repeated balloon after being told balloon, grew sharp about language for the rest of his life, careful of adjectives, suspicious of neat endings. Years later, when a grandchild asked him what he did in the war, he answered with a paragraph that did not include Roswell and did not include July, but did include the sentence, "Some truths are not improved by being spoken badly." He said it gently, like a man handing down a tool. In the absence of answers, rituals formed to hold the shape of questions. On summer nights, families in Roswell sat on porches and pointed out the same constellations, the act itself a kind of reassurance, names that stayed put even if other things did not. On certain anniversaries, a few locals, never many, rarely the same faces, drove a slow loop out past the old ranch road, rolled down their windows and listened, not for engines, not for voices, for the feeling that had once crossed the land and then been filed away. Meanwhile, the paperwork multiplied in distant rooms. Some of it traveled under new covers to new cabinets when agencies changed names. Some of it wore fresh stamps as policies updated their wardrobes. A page that had once lived in confidential attire found itself suited in secret, and then no foreign, and later, long after the men who wrote it were gone, tucked into released with redactions, its nouns bandaged by black bars. Even stripped, the page breathed faintly. Paper, for all its theater of finality, is a poor coffin. Years rolled forward. The world found more headlines. Roswell's case slept in drawers that outlasted desks, in cabinets that outlasted offices. But sleep is not erasure. When curiosity rose again, when an author asked, when a veteran finally spoke, when a grandchild found an old clipping folded behind a photograph, the debriefings were felt in the room like a draft under a door. They had not ended the story. They had taught it to travel softly. That is their most enduring imprint, a change of gait. The people of Roswell, and others far away who came to care, learned to walk the subject without startling it. You do not lunge at a skittish horse, you give it your shoulder and time. So the legend grew on small breaths and careful steps, witness accounts couched as recollections, evidence framed as questions, conclusions issued like invitations. Listen, decide what you will, sleep if you can. In this way, the debriefings, intended to compress the event down to a manageable line, expanded it into something that lives in margins. The official narrative stands, thin and tidy. Beside it runs the human narrative, thick with pauses and weather and porch boards that creak under memory. Between the two, the distance is measured not in miles but in tone. Sometimes after midnight, the difference is audible. A veteran wakes and hears again the shutter of the camera in the debris field, a small sound that opened into a room full of silence. A teacher steps onto an old porch and finds her hand resting where it rested the night. A light moved without sound. A rancher's gate lifts on tired hinges, and the field beyond looks exactly like any field, except to the one who knows where the glitter lay. These are not proofs in the laboratory sense, they are proofs in the life sense, which is to say, they persist. And so the debriefings did what paper always does at its best and worst. They captured a shape, then suggested the shape was the thing itself. They tamed the event into sentences, then declared the sentences supreme. They closed the drawer and mistook the click for silence. The desert did not make that mistake. It kept its open ledger. Wind signed it in long strokes. Rain added short, rare punctuation. The sun wrote the same line, daily, across the horizon. On clear nights, the stars filled the margins like careful notes. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the footnote that underlies the main text. Something happened. Not spelled out, not sealed, not sorted, simply held. By the time the last of the original clerks retired, by the time the last of the original officers gave polite, bounded interviews, the scars of secrecy had done their work. They had taught a generation to carry mysteries lightly, to honor a story by not crushing it with certainty. Perhaps that is the strangest gift of the debriefings. In trying to make the thing smaller, they made listeners larger, more patient with ambiguity, more willing to sit with the dark until their eyes adjusted. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and the files, despite their stamps and sleeps, never closed over the living edge of the story. It moved beneath them, under paper and policy, out across the open land, where a fence line runs straight toward a horizon that keeps its distance, and a man can still stop, remove his hat, and let the night say what it will. The desert remembers more than it tells. Winds sweep across the plains of New Mexico, carrying dust over old fence lines and dried riverbeds, erasing tracks, softening edges. Yet beneath that shifting skin of earth, something remains. People of Roswell felt it. They knew that the summer of 1947 had carried them into a story larger than themselves. And then, almost as suddenly, the story vanished. It was not that the event was forgotten. It was that it was silenced. The press that had first shouted about a flying disc now spoke of weather balloons with equal certainty. Officials who had looked startled now spoke with calm precision. The public, confused, accepted the correction. One headline replaced another, and soon the world's eyes turned back to other matters. But for those who had been close to it, the silence felt heavy. The memory of debris on ranch land, the sight of military trucks rolling through town, the fragments handled and hidden, all of it remained vivid, and yet no one asked any more. not in daylight. At the base, the quiet was even deeper. Officers filed their reports, sealed their notes, and went on with drills, patrols, and missions. The airfield buzzed with engines, the radios crackled with orders, but beneath the noise lay a hush, a studied refusal to speak of what had been seen. Men who had gathered fragments one week spoke of nothing the next. Pilots who had scanned skies for anomalies returned to routine flight schedules. The extraordinary had been folded into the ordinary, pressed flat by discipline. In Washington, the files traveled upward, tucked into folders, labeled, indexed. Clerks stamped them, officers skimmed them, higher offices shelved them. The words within were reduced to phrases: unidentified lights, unusual debris, no threat indicated. Layers of language muted the shock. What had once seemed extraordinary became paperwork, its strangeness buried beneath headings and numbers. This was how silence was built, not by erasing, but by smothering. Not by denial alone, but by repetition of another story, until the first became faint. In Roswell itself, the silence was not official, but personal. Families, who had spoken freely to neighbors one evening, decided, the next, to say little. The reasons varied. Some feared ridicule, others feared attention. Some simply wished to return to normal, to the rhythms of planting and harvest, of children running through dust and dogs barking at night. But the silence was shared, unspoken yet binding. It created a curious tension. The sky overhead seemed larger now, filled with possibilities unmentioned, while conversations remained smaller, narrowed to the safe and ordinary. A child might ask about the soldiers who passed through, but the question would be met with a quick shake of the head. A neighbor might bring up the newspaper's first headline, but the room would grow still. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a constant awareness of something not being said. Decades later, when researchers returned to gather accounts, they would encounter this silence as if it were another witness. They would find men and women who remembered clearly, but spoke cautiously, as though the silence itself might disapprove. They would find documents where paragraphs had been clipped, notes missing, pages lost. They would find the hush, not only in memory, but in paper, in gaps, in omissions. The silence spread beyond Roswell. It touched other towns, other bases, other skies. Whenever something unexplained appeared, the pattern repeated: an initial spark of alarm, then the cool press of denial, followed by the settling hush. Pilots spoke of it, we reported, they nodded, and nothing more was said. Radar operators whispered the same, we logged it, and the logs disappeared. Some came to believe the silence itself was policy, a doctrine shaped not by a single event, but by a principle that the extraordinary must be kept ordinary, at least on paper. And yet, silence is never complete. Whispers escaped, files surfaced decades later, retired officers allowed themselves careful words. The silence cracked at its edges, revealing just enough to remind the world that beneath it lay something vast. For the people of Roswell, though, the most haunting silence was not from government or media, it was from the sky itself. That summer, the heavens had seemed alive, filled with something unexplainable. Then they returned to stillness. Stars shone as they always had. The moon traced its silver arc. Clouds drifted, storms came and went, but those who had seen could never look upward without remembering. The silence from above was not ordinary. It was charged, as though the sky had spoken once and then withdrawn, leaving behind both awe and unease. The desert nights stretched long and quiet. Crickets sang, coyotes howled, and the stars blinked in cold clarity. Yet for those who remembered, each night carried an echo, the thought that something could return, could descend again without warning. The silence was not comfort, it was expectation unfulfilled. And so the story of Roswell entered its long hush. Witnesses grew older, children became adults, files gathered dust, but the silence itself became part of the legend. A silence too heavy to be natural, too deliberate to be chance. The sky above Roswell said nothing more, and in that silence, the mystery deepened. Silence, when stretched too long, begins to fray. At first it is seamless, like cloth pulled taut across a frame, but with time, small threads work loose, edges curl, seams split. The silence after Roswell was no different. Though the official story sat firm in newspapers, though the files were sealed in cabinets, the quiet began to carry its own betrayals. In Roswell, the first cracks appeared in ordinary conversations. A rancher mentioned to his brother that he still remembered the odd weight of the metal. A clerk confided to her neighbor that the files she handled had been marked more strictly than anything she had ever seen before. A soldier, in the quiet of a bar, admitted that the fragments looked nothing like balloons. None of these voices were loud, none sought an audience. Yet the words traveled, carried by trust and curiosity, like sparks sheltered against the wind. Journalists, too, sensed the gaps. A reporter who had covered the initial press release kept a private folder of notes, unsatisfied with the balloon explanation. He wrote questions in the margins. Why so quick to retract? Why such secrecy? Why so many soldiers for a balloon? His notes never made print, but they survived in his desk, reminders that silence does not erase doubt. By the 1950s, the world had shifted, the Cold War deepened, and the skies were filled with new machines, jets, rockets, satellites. Reports of strange lights grew more common. Pilots spoke of objects that moved against the wind. Radar operators whispered of blips that outpaced jets. Each new report echoed faintly against the silence of Roswell, as though the desert story was a foundation beneath all others. Researchers began to circle. Some were retired officers, curious about old files. Others were civilians with notebooks and patience. They traveled to Roswell, knocked on doors, asked quiet questions. Many were turned away. Some were invited in. Over coffee or at kitchen tables, they heard stories that had been carried for decades. A man described how sheep had refused a certain field. A woman recalled soldiers reminding her to forget what she had seen. A deputy repeated how the metal had folded and smoothed without a crease. These researchers wrote carefully, piecing together fragments of memory. Their books and articles did not break the silence completely, but they weakened it. Each publication was like a hammer tapping at a wall, not to topple it in one blow, but to reveal that it was not solid after all. Meanwhile, inside government offices, the silence persisted, but also strained. Reports of unidentified objects continued to flow in from bases across the country. Files labeled unknown began to accumulate. Analysts logged them, stamped them, filed them, but the act of filing did not erase the strangeness. In corridors and over coffee, officers admitted to each other that some cases did not fit balloons, did not fit planes, did not fit anything ordinary. They admitted this quietly, never in writing, never in public. Yet the admission itself was a crack in the silence. For the people of Roswell, the silence grew heavier with years. The story did not vanish. It became part of the town's identity, like the water tower or the railroad tracks. Children who had grown up with whispered fragments told their own children. Families spoke of the summer when the army came without always explaining why. The silence became generational, passed down like an heirloom. And yet each generation carried the same unease. They remembered the headlines that said disc before they said balloon. They remembered the soldiers who moved with urgency. They remembered the fragments described in voices that trembled even decades later. The silence never convinced them entirely. It only delayed the telling. By the 1970s, when the first serious investigations began to publish accounts of Roswell, the silence cracked wide enough for the world to peer through. Witnesses who had been young in 1947 were older now, less concerned with ridicule, more willing to unburden themselves. They told of debris fields, of unexplainable material, of soldiers who pressed them into silence. The accounts varied, contradicted, overlapped, but together they revived a story that the army had tried to bury beneath balloons. The silence from above had not ended. The official files remained sealed. The official explanation remained the same. But outside those walls the cracks widened, and with each voice that spoke, with each book that was written, with each question that refused to fade, the silence lost a little of its power. The desert still held its hush, the stars still blinked with indifference, but the people beneath them knew that silence does not mean absence. Sometimes it means presence too heavy to name. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and the cracks in that silence whispered of truths still waiting. Silence is contagious. It spreads the way a shadow does, reaching across boundaries without asking permission. After Roswell, the hush did not remain in the desert alone. It traveled outward, settling over other skies, other bases, other governments. What began as a quiet in New Mexico became a pattern felt across the world. In Canada, reports trickled in of objects moving swiftly over forests and lakes. Pilots described discs glinting in the sun. Fishermen told of lights hovering silently above water. Yet when their stories reached military desks, the language shifted. What had been a disc became a weather anomaly. What had been a light became unconfirmed. Reports were filed, stamped, and put away. The pattern was the same: acknowledge, then dismiss, then store. In Britain, radar operators at coastal stations logged returns that darted and circled faster than any aircraft they knew. The logs were forwarded, the officers debriefed. Soon after, the official statements spoke only of calibration errors, of birds, of balloons drifting too high. The silence was not empty, it was deliberate. The ministry kept files, shelves grew heavy with them, but the public heard only the simpler version, nothing unusual. In the Soviet Union, whispers carried a similar shape. Pilots spoke cautiously of objects that outpaced their fastest jets. Villagers described glowing spheres in night skies. Yet in official briefings, such reports were smothered beneath phrases like foreign propaganda or natural phenomenon. To speak otherwise was dangerous. The silence there was enforced with more than words. Across continents, the response was mirrored. The extraordinary witnessed, the ordinary explained, the silence reinforced. Governments did not coordinate in daylight, but their shadows moved alike. Each seemed to understand that to admit too much was to lose control of the sky. Roswell was not mentioned in these official statements, yet the spirit of its silence lived within them. The sudden announcement, the swift retraction, the firm replacement with something ordinary, this became the model. The world had learned from that desert town that the best way to contain a story was not to deny it outright, but to offer another version, louder, simpler, safer, and so silence became doctrine. For the witnesses themselves, scattered across the globe, the effect was familiar. A farmer in France who had seen a glowing disk skim his fields in the night was told by officials it must have been a weather balloon. A sailor in the Pacific who had watched a sphere of light dance across waves was told it was St. Elmo's fire. A pilot in South America who had chased a bright object that outran his plane was told it was a meteor. Each knew the explanation was incomplete, but each was reminded, directly or indirectly, that silence was safer. The silence also seeped into science. Astronomers who glimpsed anomalies in their telescopes learned quickly that to report them too eagerly was to risk ridicule. Meteorologists who tracked unusual radar echoes found their data reclassified, their reports trimmed. The language of academia grew cautious. The word unidentified became a fence, keeping awe at bay. Yet silence does not erase, it accumulates. Each suppressed report added weight to the file cabinets. Each dismissed sighting lingered in the memory of the witness. Each contradiction between what was seen and what was said deepened the crack in the wall of denial. By the late 1950s, whispers had become too numerous to ignore. Civilian groups formed, collecting testimonies governments would not acknowledge. Amateur researchers traveled to small towns, knocked on doors, and listened the way official debriefings never had, with patience, without judgment. They gathered stories not only from Roswell, but from Canada, Britain, France, Brazil, Australia. Everywhere the sky had spoken, people had listened. Everywhere the governments had hushed, the witnesses had remembered. And in each of those stories, the shadow of Roswell flickered. People compared their accounts to the tale of the desert disk, whispered of the Army's sudden silence. They sensed the pattern, the quick denial, the balloon explanation, the heavy hush. The silence from above had become global, yet in its vastness, it also became fragile. Too many witnesses, too many stories, too many cracks. What had been a single file in New Mexico now echoed in countless cabinets across the world. The effort to suppress became itself a kind of admission. Why so much secrecy, if there was nothing to hide? The desert sky over Roswell remained quiet, but far away, other skies flickered, other silences fell. The hush was no longer local, it was planetary. Still, the silence carried its same tone, calm, official, dismissive. Weather balloons, Venus, meteors, birds, ball lightning, misidentified planes. Each explanation smoothed the edges, lulled the questions, offered the comfort of ordinary words. Yet beneath those words, the extraordinary lingered, waiting. The desert taught the pattern. The world repeated it, and silence itself became the language. Governments spoke most fluently when the skies grew strange. The sky was not empty. The silence was not ordinary, and from New Mexico outward, the hush became global. Silence has a way of outgrowing its purpose. What began as a tactic to close a story became, with time, the very soil in which legend grew. By refusing to explain, by speaking only in the thinnest words, balloons, meteors, birds, authorities created a vacuum, and nature and people abhor a vacuum. Into that void, imagination poured. In Roswell, the silence settled into everyday life like dust on shelves. People learned to live with it, even as they felt it pressing. Neighbors who had once speculated freely grew cautious, yet the hush itself became part of town identity. Visitors asked, tourists wondered, strangers leaned in with curiosity. Roswell's silence was its reputation. It was not what was said that carried, but what was withheld. Beyond New Mexico, the hush rippled outward into culture. Films in the 1950s filled drive-in screens with saucers and shadows, drawing directly from whispers the government never confirmed. Radio shows spoke of lights in the sky, dramatized into fiction but rooted in something real enough to unsettle. Books began to compile testimonies, some sober, some sensational, each shaped by the absence of official answers. Silence itself became the muse. For the witnesses, the long hush weighed heavily. Some kept their memories locked within, sharing only in old age. Others wrote them in letters, never sent, journals never published. The act of remembering, unspoken, became a kind of private ritual. They lit no candles, spoke no prayers, but the silence around their memories was reverent, as if they were tending an altar of secrecy, not of their own making. And yet, silence breeds suspicion. The more ordinary explanations were offered, the less ordinary they sounded. A weather balloon might explain fragments of foil, but could it explain beams that would not break? Could it explain symbols that faded in sunlight? Each time the Army repeated its story, the people who had seen differently heard only the gap between words and memory. That gap grew wider with each year. Culturally, Roswell became shorthand. To say Roswell was to invoke not only the desert event, but the very idea of secrecy, of government silence, of mysteries withheld. The word traveled into conversations far removed from the town itself. It became a metaphor, a symbol, a myth, yet one always tethered to something that had once been real, tangible, touched. For children growing up in later decades, the silence itself was the inheritance. They did not see the fragments, but they heard the way adults lowered their voices. They did not ride out to the debris field, but they read the clipped newspaper lines and sensed the weight of what was missing. The absence of words became its own education. They learned that sometimes what is not said matters more than what is. Around the world, Roswell's hush was mirrored in other stories. In France, in Brazil, in Australia, in Britain, each nation carried its own silence, its own denials, its own withheld reports. Yet Roswell remained the touchstone, the origin point of the global hush. The first official voice that said too much, then said too little, then said nothing at all. And as the silence stretched across decades, it transformed. It became less about a single event and more about a posture toward the unknown. To the public, the refusal to speak clearly felt like an answer in itself. Something worth hiding must exist. The lack of clarity became evidence. The silence became proof. By the 1980s and 90s, when Roswell resurfaced in documentaries and books, the silence had grown mythic. The desert itself seemed to hum with it, attracting tourists, researchers, and dreamers. People drove down dusty roads not to see fragments. They were long gone, but to stand in the echo of silence. They came to look at fences, at planes, at skies, and to feel the weight of what was not said. Officials still repeated balloons, still offered mundane explanations, but by then their words fell into the background. The myth was louder. The silence had grown into a presence larger than any report, larger even than the fragments themselves. The hush had become a legend, and legends are harder to bury than facts. For Roswell, the silence from above did more than close a case. It opened a doorway into cultural memory, into endless retellings, into books and films and whispers that never stopped. What the army had sealed in crates and files was released again in kitchens and classrooms, in drive-ins and late-night radio. The silence became not an end, but a beginning. The desert at night still carried its stillness. Stars shone cold and steady. Coyotes howled, winds shifted, fences creaked, but those who listened could feel the difference. The silence was not ordinary. It was charged, alive with what had once broken it. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and in that silence, the story of Roswell became eternal. When the trucks left Foster Ranch in 1947, their wheels cutting ruts into the dirt road, no one imagined the story they carried would stretch across generations. The crates were bound, the reports filed, the press redirected. To those in uniform, it seemed finished, but Roswell was not finished. It never would be. The first aftermath was simple confusion. In town, people spoke in lowered voices about how the army could say disc one day and balloon the next. Farmers shook their heads in cafes. Deputies leaned back in chairs and muttered that something didn't sit right. Children overheard, carried fragments of conversations into playground whispers. Already the silence was breeding a second story, not only of fragments on a ranch, but of contradictions that made less sense than the mystery itself. For the witnesses, the aftermath took the form of long years of restraint. Mac Brazel retreated into his work, keeping his head down, his words short. Deputies, who had bent the strange foil, said little more. Nurses who had glimpsed stretchers at the base walked the halls with silence stitched into their steps. The event had passed, but its weight remained, pressing on them each time they looked at the desert sky. Nationally, the story faded quickly. Newspapers carried it for a few days, then moved on to other headlines. Politics, weather, the mounting tension with the Soviet Union. For the wider world, Roswell became a curiosity folded neatly into memory. But in the files of the army, it remained, marked "Issy carried," preserved for eyes that seldom looked. The 1950s brought new patterns. Reports of unidentified objects appeared across the country, from pilots, from radar stations, from civilians who looked upward and saw movement where none should have been. Committees were formed, Project Sign, then Project Grudge, then the longer-running Project Blue Book. Their purpose was to log, to analyze, to explain. Roswell was included only in whispers. Officially, it was closed. But unofficially, it lingered as the case that had set the pattern. Each new sighting was weighed against the silence of Roswell. Each denial carried the echo of that first retraction. The words weather balloon became almost talismanic, invoked wherever explanations faltered. And yet, the public remembered the headlines that had once declared otherwise. In Roswell itself, the town lived in a kind of duality. Outwardly, life continued. Parades, school plays, county fairs. But beneath the surface, the town carried a reputation it could not shake. Travelers stopped and asked. Strangers leaned in with curiosity. Slowly, Roswell became a name not only of place, but of story. Its very mention carried a question mark. By the 1960s, the cultural aftermath was impossible to ignore. Films filled the screen with saucers, radio dramas spoke of visitors from beyond. The public imagination, starved of clarity, feasted on possibility. Roswell was not always named, but it was always there. The ghost beneath the dialogue, the silence that gave weight to invention. The witnesses aged, but they did not forget. A deputy retired, and over coffee with a friend, admitted again that what he had held was no balloon. A nurse told her daughter that she remembered stretchers in the night. A clerk confessed that she had filed papers heavier than their ink. These confessions were not shouted. They were passed like heirlooms, quietly but deliberately. The aftermath was also global. Other nations logged their own encounters. Britain kept files in locked cabinets. France created research groups. The Soviet Union gathered reports even as it denied them. Everywhere, the silence of Roswell seemed to echo, teaching the same lesson: to explain quickly, to deny loudly, and to file quietly. But silence does not erase. It accumulates. By the 1970s, researchers began to gather these scattered voices. They returned to Roswell, knocked on doors, sat at kitchen tables. They listened to old men and women recall what they had seen, what they had touched, what they had been told not to say. The aftermath was no longer just silence. It was testimony. The files that had been sealed in Washington grew heavier with each year. Pages were added, copies made, cabinets filled. Roswell's case remained officially closed, but unofficially alive, whispered in corridors, resurfacing whenever a new sighting drew attention. The very persistence of the story became part of its power. For Roswell, the aftermath was not a single event but a long unfolding. It was the shift from memory to legend, from fact to cultural symbol. What had happened on a ranch in 1947 became more than debris and reports. It became a touchstone for the way the world thought about the sky. The desert remained quiet, stars wheeled overhead, seasons changed, children grew, but beneath the stillness lay a story that refused to die. The sky was not empty, the silence lingered. The silence lingered, and the aftermath of Roswell stretched far beyond its fences, into decades yet to come. The silence of Roswell was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new rhythm, one that echoed across years and continents. What had happened in the desert became a template, and in the decades that followed it guided how governments responded to the unexplained. By 1948, the U.S. Air Force had established Project Sign. Its mission was clear: to gather reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, to analyze them, and to determine whether they posed a threat. Dozens of sightings were logged, some easily explained, others not. In the margins of their files, analysts wrote cautiously. Some suggested advanced foreign technology. A few even entertained the possibility of something beyond Earth. But the lesson of Roswell hung over every page. Whatever the findings, the public explanation must remain contained. Ordinary, safe. When Project Sign gave way to Project Grudge, the tone hardened. Reports were not only analyzed, they were discouraged. Witnesses who came forward were met with skepticism, sometimes ridicule. Pilots were told they had seen reflections, weather, birds. Civilians were told they had misjudged stars. planets, balloons. The aim was not only to investigate, but to reduce, to fold the extraordinary back into the ordinary. Then came Project Blue Book, lasting from 1952 into the late 1960s. It gathered thousands of reports, filling cabinets with sightings from across the country. Some were explained with neat efficiency, others resisted explanation, lingering in the files as unknown. Yet in public statements, the emphasis was always the same. There was nothing to fear, nothing beyond the ordinary. The silence of Roswell had become policy, repeated with discipline across 2 decades. But silence breeds echoes. The more officials dismissed, the more the public wondered. Why so much attention? If nothing was there, why so many files? If every answer was simple, why so many stamps of secrecy? If all the skies held were balloons and birds? The contradiction gnawed quietly at trust. Culturally, the aftermath seeped into the very fabric of the Cold War. Skies were no longer empty canvases. They were contested spaces. Jets cut contrails high above towns. Rockets lifted toward orbit. Satellites blinked overhead. Against this backdrop, reports of disks and lights felt both alarming and inevitable. People learned to live with 2 truths, the official one, which said nothing was unusual, and the whispered one, which said the sky was alive with mysteries unspoken. Roswell lingered beneath it all. It was not named in Blue Book press releases, but its shadow was present. Every denial carried the echo of that first retraction. Every balloon explanation traced its lineage back to the desert of 1947. Even in silence, Roswell spoke. The witnesses themselves aged into the Cold War years, carrying their memories quietly. Some watched the new wave of UFO reports with recognition, nodding as though seeing a pattern confirmed. Others kept to their silence, wary of ridicule, wary of the press, wary of the military presence that had once pressed so firmly on their shoulders. But in their kitchens, in their living rooms, they remembered. By the 1960s, Roswell's story had become almost mythic within certain circles. Researchers passed notes, compared testimonies, gathered clippings. They sensed that the silence was not absence but design. They knocked on doors in Roswell and found people still hesitant, still careful, but willing in small ways to speak. Slowly the fragments of memory resurfaced, pieced together into a mosaic that challenged the official narrative. The broader world was changing too. The space age had begun. Humans had touched the edge of orbit, and soon would walk on the moon. In this new landscape, the idea of visitors from beyond no longer seemed quite so impossible. Roswell's silence, once firm, now seemed more like a veil than a wall, and in popular culture, the silence had already burst. Films filled screens with saucers, television shows hinted at cover-ups, novels wove tales of encounters hidden from the public. The Army and Air Force may have kept their balloon story, but the imagination of the public had already chosen otherwise. The Cold War atmosphere made silence even more potent. Secrecy was everywhere, about weapons, about spies, about satellites. In that climate, the idea of a government withholding the truth about Roswell felt not only plausible, but inevitable. Silence was the signature of the age, and Roswell was its earliest page. Through it all, the desert remained unchanged. The wind moved across sage and sand. Coyotes howled, fences rattled, stars burned cold. The land did not care about projects or files, about policy or press releases, but the people who lived there did. They felt the weight of silence each time the story was dismissed, each time officials spoke of balloons while their memories whispered otherwise. The sky was not empty. The silence lingered, and Roswell's aftermath became the blueprint of an era. For 2 decades after 1947, Roswell lived mainly in whispers. The Army had filed its balloon report. The newspapers had moved on, and the public had turned its eyes to other skies, to Sputnik streaking overhead, to Mercury rockets, to the long climb toward the moon. But beneath those larger stories, Roswell lingered. It waited in kitchens, in journals, in the silences of men and women who had seen too much to forget. By the 1970s, the waiting ended. Researchers, driven by curiosity and by a sense that silence itself was evidence, returned to the desert town. They carried tape recorders, notebooks, questions that had been ignored for too long. They knocked on doors where witnesses had grown older, where children had become adults, where memories had softened but not vanished, and slowly, carefully, the voices began to return. A deputy sheriff recalled bending the strange foil, watching it unfold without a crease. A ranch hand described beams that resisted every effort to break. A nurse spoke of stretchers wheeled through base corridors in the night, sheets pulled tightly over them. A clerk remembered files stamped more heavily than any she had handled before. These accounts were not new, not to the people who had carried them for years, but now, spoken aloud, recorded, transcribed, they became part of a larger story. Books followed, articles filled with testimony and speculation. Conferences invited witnesses to share their accounts. What had been whispers became sentences. What had been silence became a chorus. The name Roswell, once just a town on a map, became a word spoken with awe, suspicion, fascination. The cultural moment was ready. The world had walked on the moon. Satellites circled overhead. The Cold War had made secrecy a daily fact of life. Against this backdrop, Roswell's story resonated. The idea that something extraordinary had happened, and had been buried under balloon reports and silence, felt not only possible, but likely. By the 1980s, the legend had taken firm root. Television specials dramatized the accounts. Documentaries replayed the voices of ranchers, deputies, nurses. Each program drew new listeners, new believers. Roswell was no longer just a local memory, it was international. For the witnesses, the aftermath of resurfacing was mixed. Some felt relief, as though finally unburdened of years of silence. Others felt unease, not wanting attention, not seeking fame. They had carried their memories quietly for so long that speaking them aloud felt like breaking a pact. Yet they spoke, and in doing so, they changed the world's perception. The government's silence continued, but now it had competition. Official files still repeated balloons, still dismissed speculation, still stamped pages, secret. But in living rooms and bookstores, in conference halls and late-night radio shows, another story thrived. A story built not from official lines, but from human voices. The 1990s brought Roswell to its peak in popular imagination. A major anniversary rekindled interest. Films portrayed crash sites and cover-ups. Television series wove the story into their plots. Tourists arrived in Roswell, drawn not by the certainty of answers, but by the allure of questions. The town embraced its role, building museums, hosting festivals. What had once been silence now rang with curiosity and commerce, and through it all, the witnesses' voices remained at the center. They were not polished or unified, they contradicted each other at times, but their persistence gave weight to the story. Each account was another thread woven into a tapestry that could no longer be ignored. The desert, too, played its part. Visitors stood at fences and looked across empty fields, listening to the wind. They saw nothing unusual, yet they felt the silence, the charged quiet that had lingered since 1947. The absence itself became presence, the hush became proof. Roswell had become more than an event. It had become a lens through which people viewed the unknown, a metaphor for secrecy, a symbol of possibility. The aftermath had transformed silence into story, and story into legend. The sky was not empty, the silence lingered. And in the late 20th century, Roswell rose again, louder than ever before. By the time the 21st century arrived, Roswell was no longer only a memory of 1947. It had become something larger, a thread woven into the fabric of how humanity thought about the skies. The desert town that once lived in silence now stood as a symbol whispered across continents. Its name alone carried weight, conjuring images of fragments, crates, soldiers, and secrets. In government halls, the story never fully left the cabinets. Files were declassified in small waves, some pages intact, others blacked out in thick ink. The documents offered details, flight times, weather data, inventories, but they seldom addressed the heart of the matter. Instead, they revealed something else, the persistence of secrecy. Even half a century later, whole paragraphs remained hidden. The silence had grown old, but it had not dissolved. In public life, Roswell had become shorthand for hidden truths. Politicians invoked it casually when speaking of government secrecy. "We don't want another Roswell." Journalists used it as metaphor, likening corporate cover-ups to Roswell moments. The name had stepped beyond its desert origins. It was now an emblem of doubt itself, proof that once an official story had shifted too quickly, leaving behind suspicion that never healed. The witnesses were older now. Many had passed on, their accounts left behind in transcripts, recordings, books, but those who remained continued to speak, sometimes in interviews, sometimes at festivals, sometimes to grandchildren in hushed tones. Their voices were slower, but their memories had not dimmed. They still spoke of foil that refused to crease, beams that resisted breaking, stretchers wheeled through halls at night. They carried the same calm insistence that had survived every decade. What they saw was not what the official story claimed. For Roswell itself, the aftermath became a livelihood. Tourists walked its streets, visited museums, bought souvenirs shaped like discs and stars. The town leaned into the legend, turning silence into spectacle. Yet beneath the commerce, the weight of the real story remained. The museum walls displayed headlines, testimonies, artifacts. Visitors lingered not only for novelty, but for the charged hush that seemed to cling to every retelling. Culturally, Roswell continued to inspire. Films, television, novels, all drew from its myth. Some portrayed alien craft and cover-ups with drama and spectacle. Others explored the silence itself, the unease of unanswered questions. Each adaptation was a reflection of how deeply the story had embedded itself in imagination. Roswell had become a myth, and myths, unlike events, do not end. The government's silence, however, still pressed forward. When new reports of unidentified aerial phenomena surfaced in the 2000s and 2010s, Roswell was always mentioned. Investigative journalists, lawmakers, and researchers pointed back to 1947 as the beginning of the pattern: report, deny, classify, forget. The balloon explanation had long since worn thin. What remained was the knowledge that silence had been policy once, and likely was still. Even as official hearings began in later years, where pilots and officials spoke openly about strange objects tracked on radar, Roswell lingered in the background. Lawmakers referenced it with half smiles, journalists invoked it as precedent, the public heard it as proof. Whether or not the truth of Roswell was ever revealed in full, its place was secure. It was the case that made silence suspicious. The desert, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Winds swept across sage and sand, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent, ancient. Coyotes cried at night, fences rattled in the dark. The field where fragments had once glittered grew grass and silence again. Yet for those who stood there, the air still felt charged, as if memory itself clung to the soil. The place had become more than land. It was a threshold. The aftermath of Roswell was not measured in answers, it was measured in echoes. Each new sighting anywhere in the world carried with it the faint hum of 1947. Each new denial carried the echo of that first retraction. Each new whisper of secrecy carried the weight of crates loaded under canvas in a desert dawn. And so Roswell endured, not because the truth was laid bare, but because silence itself had become truth enough. The sky was not empty. the silence lingered, and Roswell's aftermath stretched into the present, refusing to fade, refusing to be filed away. The desert holds its silence still. Wind moves across the sage, carrying dust in long arcs. The stars above burn steady, as they did in 1947, as they do tonight. The fences creak, the coyotes call, the grasses bend and lift, and somewhere in that endless stretch of land, memory lingers, not in fragments of metal or sealed files, but in the stories whispered across decades. Roswell has become more than a place. It has become a mirror. When people speak of it, they are not only speaking of a field in New Mexico, they are speaking of wonder, of secrecy, of the weight of silence and the persistence of memory. The story began with something small, a rancher riding out at dawn, a glint in the grass, fragments scattered across the soil, pieces that bent and returned, beams that refused to break, markings that faded in the sun. Simple discoveries in an ordinary pasture, and yet those discoveries grew into something vast, a legend carried across generations. From that moment, silence began its work. Soldiers arrived, crates were filled, reports were written, a press release spoke of discs, a retraction spoke of balloons. Between those two voices, a gap opened. Into that gap, doubt slipped, and doubt never left. The witnesses carried their memories quietly, deputies who bent the foil, nurses who saw stretchers, clerks who filed heavy folders, children who watched lights in the sky. None shouted their truths, they whispered them, passed them down, carried them like heirlooms. Their voices formed a constellation, scattered but connected, lighting the night in ways official silence could not erase. The government's debriefings pressed hard, reports were stamped, phrases softened, files sealed, balloons, balloons, balloons. Yet beneath the paper, the memories endured. Silence does not erase. It accumulates. Each dismissal, each denial, added another layer of weight to the story, until the silence itself became proof. And then, decades later, the story rose again. Researchers knocked on doors, asked careful questions. Witnesses, older now, spoke with calm persistence. Books were written, documentaries aired, festivals held. The name Roswell leapt from whisper to headline. Once more. This time, it was not silenced. This time, it had grown too large. The legend spread across the globe, into films, into television, into novels, into political speeches and casual metaphors. Roswell became a symbol, not only of what may have fallen in the desert, but of the way truths can be hidden, and the way silence itself can speak. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let that silence surround you, not as a weight, but as a blanket. Imagine the desert night, the wide horizon, the soft brush of wind, the distant sound of animals settling. The stars above stretch endlessly, patient, watchful, each one a witness, each one a reminder that the sky is never truly empty. The story of Roswell will never be settled. It was never meant to be. It lives in two places at once, in the files that say balloon, and in the voices that say otherwise. Between them lies mystery, and mystery is what keeps the story alive. Perhaps in time, more files will open. Perhaps one day, clarity will replace silence. But even then, the heart of Roswell will remain the same. A reminder that the universe is larger than we imagine, that the skies above hold questions still waiting to be asked. Let your breath slow with that thought. Let your body grow heavy. The mystery does not need solving tonight. It only needs holding, the way one holds a fragile piece of memory or a fragment of metal that bends but does not break. The desert is quiet now. The ranches sleep. The fences wait for morning light, and the stars, unchanged, burn steadily overhead. The silence lingers. The sky is not empty, and somewhere in that silence, the story of Roswell continues to hum, gentle, endless, eternal.